They lined us up like cattle at auction, 23 unmarried women in Redford's town square, forced into our finest dresses so strange men could choose. I stood there in borrowed red silk that cut into my flesh, praying to become invisible. But when the sheriff dragged that scarred cowboy to the platform and ordered him to pick a wife, I felt every eye in that crowd land on me. The fat girl, the joke, the one they'd been whispering about since birth. The laughter started before he even spoke. What happened next would shatter everything this town believed about worth, beauty, and what it means to be chosen. I'm Mara Ellison, and this is the story of how I went from being Redford's greatest shame to discovering I was never the broken one at all. Stay until the end, and please comment what city you're watching from. I want to know how far my story travels beyond these unforgiving Pennsylvania hills. The rooster hadn't even crowed when Mother's voice cut through my bedroom door like a blade through butter. Mara Ellison, if I have to come in there, you'll regret the day you were born more than you already do. I was already awake. I'd been awake for hours watching the pre-dawn light creep across the wooden planks of my ceiling, counting the knots in the pine boards the way I'd done since childhood. 17 knots. Always 17. Some mornings, that simple constancy was the only predictable thing in my world. I pushed myself upright, the bed frame groaning under my weight, a sound that had haunted me since I was 12 years old, when my body had begun its transformation from simply sturdy to what the town ladies whispered was unfortunate. The mirror on my dresser reflected what I'd learned to avoid looking at: a round face with soft features, brown eyes that held too much hope for someone in my position, and a body that spilled beyond the boundaries this strict Amish community deemed acceptable for unmarried women. "I'm coming, Mother," I called, my voice still rough with sleep. I pulled on my plain gray work dress, one of 3 I owned, all sewn with extra fabric that Mother complained about wasting. The material had been purchased from the general store in Lancaster during one of our rare trips beyond Redford's borders, and I'd overheard Mother telling Mrs. Yoder that she'd had to special order enough cloth to make curtains for the meeting house, just to clothe her disappointing daughter. The words had felt like stones in my chest, but I'd learned to carry them. I'd learned to carry many things. The stairs creaked as I descended into the kitchen, where Mother already had breakfast laid out. Not for me, but for Father and my 2 brothers, Jacob and Samuel, who would be coming in from the morning milking soon. The scent of fresh bread and bacon filled the small space, making my stomach clench with hunger I'd learned to ignore until the men had eaten their fill. "The water buckets are empty," Mother said without looking at me, her thin hands busy at the stove. She was a narrow woman, all sharp edges and disappointed angles, as if life had carved away anything soft and left only the severe infrastructure of obligation. "And we need vegetables from the garden. The Millers are coming for supper, and I won't have them think we're unprepared." "Yes, Mother." I reached for the wooden buckets by the door, their handles worn smooth by years of my grip. "And Mara?" Now she did turn, her pale blue eyes hard as January ice. "Try not to be seen more than necessary. Mrs. Miller mentioned at last week's meeting that her son Ezra might be looking for a wife soon. I'd rather she not be reminded that we have an unmarried daughter cluttering up the house." The words hit their target. They always did. Mother had perfected the art of inflicting wounds that left no visible marks, the kind that festered in silence and darkness, away from the prying eyes of a community that valued pleasant appearances above honest pain. "I'll be quick," I said, because there was nothing else to say. The morning air outside was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of hay and turned earth. September in Pennsylvania painted the world in golds and deep greens, a beauty that felt almost mocking against the ugliness of my daily existence. Our farm sprawled across 40 acres of rolling hills, with the main house, barn, and various outbuildings clustered near the road that connected Redford to the wider world, a road I'd rarely traveled beyond the 3-mile mark to town. The well stood 50 yards from the house, surrounded by wildflowers that I'd secretly planted 2 springs ago. Mother had called them frivolous when she'd noticed, but Father had merely shrugged and said they did no harm. It was perhaps the kindest thing he'd ever said in my defense, this acknowledgement of neutral existence. I lowered the first bucket into the well's dark throat, listening to the splash echo back up. The rope burned against my palms as I hauled the water up, but I'd long ago stopped noticing such small discomforts. Physical pain had become like background noise, always present, rarely acknowledged, simply endured. "Hey there, Mara the whale! Fishing for your breakfast?" The voice carried across the morning stillness, followed by the cruel laughter of young men who'd known me since childhood and had perfected their mockery over the years. I didn't need to look to know it was Thomas Yoder and his pack of friends, boys who'd grown into men without gaining any additional kindness in the transition. I kept my eyes on the bucket, watching water slosh over the rim as I set it down and reached for the second one. "My brother says there's going to be a choosing today," Thomas continued, his voice getting closer. "Sheriff's rounding up all the unmarried women. Guess that means you'll finally get your chance, Mara, though I can't imagine any man desperate enough to— Thomas Yoder, don't you have chores of your own to tend?" Mrs. Yoder's sharp voice cut through her son's words like a switch through air. She stood at the property line, a basket of eggs balanced on her hip. Her expression caught somewhere between disapproval of her son's rudeness and agreement with his assessment. Thomas flushed red but didn't apologize. He never did. Instead, he and his friends ambled off, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke from a fire that never quite burned out. Mrs. Yoder approached the well, her eyes taking in my sweaty face, my strained expression, the way my hand shook slightly as I lowered the second bucket. "Your mother mentioned you might need extra vegetables today. I have lettuce and tomatoes I can spare." "That's kind of you," I said, meaning it. Mrs. Yoder was strict and often cold, but she functioned within a framework of community obligation that sometimes resembled kindness, even when it wasn't. "This choosing business," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "You heard about it?" I shook my head, though my heart had already begun hammering against my ribs. A choosing. The word carried weight in our community, implications I'd heard whispered about but never experienced firsthand. "Sheriff Brennan has decided we have too many unmarried women cluttering up the town." Mrs. Yoder's mouth pursed as if she'd tasted something sour. "Says it's unseemly, all these girls waiting around for proposals that aren't coming. So he's arranged for some men from the Western Territories to come through, cowboys and ranchers looking for wives. Every unmarried woman between 16 and 30 has to present herself in the town square this afternoon. No exceptions." The second bucket slipped from my grip, crashing against the stone rim of the well. Water splashed across my skirt, soaking through to my skin, but I barely felt it. "I'm 24, I whispered. "I know." Mrs. Yoder's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, child. I truly am. But the sheriff's made it mandatory. Any family that keeps their daughters hidden will face fines they can't afford. Your mother will have no choice but to present you." Present me, like a pig at market, like a horse with questionable breeding, like something to be evaluated, judged, and most likely rejected in front of the entire community that had already spent 24 years making clear exactly what they thought of my worth. What if— I had to stop, had to swallow against the tightness in my throat. What if no one chooses me? Mrs. Yoder looked away toward the distant hills that marked the edge of our valley. "Then you'll come home again, and life will go on as it has." "But Mara—" She turned back, and in her eyes I saw something I'd rarely encountered, genuine pity, tinged with guilt. "Don't hope for too much. These men, they'll be looking for wives who can work hard and bear children. They'll want—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. "They'll want women who look like acceptable wives. Women whose bodies haven't been deemed shameful by the community's narrow standards. Women who aren't me." "I understand," I said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. "Thank you for telling me." Mrs. Yoder nodded and walked away, leaving me standing beside the well with 2 buckets of water and a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. The morning that had started with simple dread had just transformed into something far worse, a guarantee of public humiliation, sanctioned by authority and wrapped in the language of community necessity. I carried the water back to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mother and Father in quiet conversation, their heads bent close together. When I pushed through the door, they separated quickly, but not before I caught the expression on Mother's face. Resignation mixed with something that might have been embarrassment. "You heard about the choosing," Mother said. "It wasn't a question." Mrs. Yoder told me. Father cleared his throat, a rumbling sound that preceded most of his rare speeches. He was a large man, broad and weathered by decades of farm work, with a beard that reached his chest and hands calloused into permanent roughness. It's the sheriff's order, Mara. We have no choice but to comply. I know, Father. You'll wear your red dress, Mother said, her tone clipped and businesslike, as if planning a funeral instead of her daughter's presentation at what amounted to a bride auction. The one we made for last year's harvest festival. It's the finest thing you own. I remembered that dress, remembered Mother's frustration as she'd let out seam after seam, muttering under her breath about wasted fabric and wasted hopes. I remembered standing for fittings while she'd pinched and pulled at the material, trying to make it lay flat against curves that refused to be minimized. Mother, maybe I could just wear my Sunday dress instead. The red one is, you'll wear the red dress. Her voice left no room for argument. We may not be able to change what you are, Mara, but we can at least try to present you as best we're able. I won't have the community saying we didn't make an effort. The message was clear. My appearance at the choosing would be as much about protecting our family's reputation as about any possibility of actually finding me a husband. I was to be dressed up and displayed so no one could accuse my parents of neglecting their duty, even if everyone, including Mother, including me, knew the outcome was already decided. I spent the rest of the morning in the garden, pulling vegetables and trying not to think about the afternoon ahead. The earth was warm under my hands, rich and loamy, smelling of growth and decay in equal measure. Out here, among the beans and tomatoes and carrots, I could almost pretend I was valued. Plants didn't care about the size of my waist or the roundness of my face. They responded to careful tending, to the time I spent nurturing them, to the attention I paid to their needs. If only people worked the same way. Mara! Jacob's voice carried across the garden. My oldest brother stood at the edge of the vegetable rows, his hat in his hands, his expression uncomfortable. At 28, Jacob was already married with 2 children, living in a house on the eastern edge of our property. He had Mother's narrow features, but Father's kinder eyes, and he'd been less cruel than most during our childhood. A low bar, perhaps, but one I'd been grateful for nonetheless. What is it? I called back, wiping dirt from my hands onto my apron. He approached slowly, as if navigating dangerous ground. I wanted to say, about today. About the choosing. He stopped, clearly struggling for words. I'm sorry, Mara. It's not right, parading women around like livestock. If I had any power to stop it, I would. The kindness in his voice nearly undid me. I'd built such careful walls against cruelty that simple compassion threatened to crack them wide open. It's not your fault, I managed. It's just the way things are. The way things are isn't always the way things should be. Jacob's jaw tightened. Sarah wanted me to tell you. Sarah was his wife, a gentle woman who'd always treated me with basic human decency, which made her exceptional in my experience. She wanted me to tell you that you deserve better than this. All of it. The way Mother treats you, the way the town talks. You deserve better. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, pressing it into my palm. When I looked down, I saw a carved wooden bird, a tiny sparrow, every feather detailed with painstaking care. I made it for you, he said quietly. Father taught me wood carving when I was young, but I never showed anyone my work. It seemed frivolous. But Sarah said, he paused, swallowing hard. She said you might need to remember that you're not alone, even when it feels like you are. The sparrow fit perfectly in my hand, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight, reaching for a sky it would never actually touch. I closed my fingers around it, feeling the smooth wood against my skin, and allowed myself one moment of weakness, one moment where I let tears fall without trying to hide them. Thank you, I whispered. Jacob nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked away, leaving me alone in the garden with a wooden bird and the knowledge that at least one person in this community saw me as something more than a burden or a joke. But one person's kindness wouldn't change what was coming. At noon, Mother called me inside to prepare. The red dress hung on my bedroom door like an accusation, its deep crimson color seeming to mock the idea that I could ever be anything worth desiring. Mother had spent extra money on the fabric, a rare extravagance that she'd mentioned repeatedly during the sewing process, as if the cost of the material should somehow make up for the disappointment of the daughter who would wear it. "Take off your work clothes," Mother instructed, her hands already reaching for the buttons of my dress. "We need to get you washed and properly attired." The next hour passed in a blur of cold water, rough soap, and Mother's increasingly frustrated attempts to make me presentable. She pulled my brown hair back so tightly it made my scalp ache, then covered it with my best prayer cap, white and starched, and completely impractical for anything other than Sunday services or, apparently, public humiliation. The red dress went on last, and even I had to admit that Mother had done exceptional work with the sewing. The bodice fit snugly without cutting off my breathing. The skirt fell in smooth lines that almost disguised the full scope of my hips, and the color brought out warmth in my complexion that I hadn't known existed. For one brief, dangerous moment, looking at my reflection in the small mirror, I let myself wonder, what if? What if one of these Western men saw past the surface? What if someone looked at me and saw not the disappointment I'd been taught I was, but someone worth choosing? What if— "Stop preening," Mother snapped, though I hadn't moved. "The dress is as good as it's going to get. It can't work miracles." And just like that, the moment of dangerous hope shattered, leaving behind the familiar shards of resignation. The wagon ride into Redford took 30 minutes, with me sitting in the back beside Samuel, who spent the entire journey staring anywhere but at me. He was 22 and newly engaged to Emma Stoltzfus, a pretty girl with a laugh like wind chimes and a figure that nobody whispered about. Samuel had inherited Mother's narrow frame and her ability to exist in the world without apology, and I'd long ago stopped expecting anything from him beyond basic civility. Redford's town square was already crowded when we arrived. The sheriff had set up a platform in the center, rough wooden planks elevated 3 feet off the ground, with steps leading up on one side. Women milled around in clusters, some dressed as carefully as I was, others looking like they'd been dragged from their chores with minimal preparation. I recognized most of them, girls I'd grown up with, women who'd attended the same school and church services, familiar faces that had watched my humiliation unfold across 2 decades without ever intervening. Rebecca Lapp stood near the platform with her mother, her blonde hair perfect beneath her cap, her figure exactly what the community's standards demanded. She caught my eye and quickly looked away, but not before I saw the mixture of pity and relief in her expression. Pity that I had to be here. Relief that she at least had a chance of being chosen before being sent home in shame. "Mara?" A hand grabbed my arm, and I turned to find Sarah, Jacob's wife, her round face flushed with anger. "This is barbaric, absolutely barbaric. I told Jacob we should leave Redford, go to one of the progressive communities in Ohio where people have left these old ways behind." "It's all right," I said automatically, the words I'd trained myself to say whenever anyone showed me kindness I hadn't earned through suffering. "It's not all right." Sarah's voice rose enough to attract attention from nearby women who turned to stare at us. She lowered her voice but didn't soften her words. "You deserve better than this, Mara. You deserve to be treated like a human being, not cattle." Before I could respond, a bell rang sharp and clear across the square. Sheriff Brennan stepped onto the platform, his brass star catching the afternoon sunlight. He was a thick-set man in his 50s, with a face weathered by years of enforcing order in a community that prized obedience above nearly everything else. "Ladies and gentlemen of Redford," his voice carried across the crowd with practiced authority, "we've gathered here today to address a situation that has become increasingly problematic for our community. We have, by my count, 23 unmarried women taking up space in our homes and consuming resources that could be better allocated to growing families. This is unseemly and impractical." A murmur ran through the crowd, mostly agreement from the older men and women, uncomfortable shifting from the younger people and those who still remembered that human beings weren't livestock to be allocated for maximum efficiency. "Fortunately," the sheriff continued, "I've been in correspondence with several ranchers and cowboys from the Western Territories who are in need of wives. Hardworking men who can provide good homes for women willing to embrace the duties of marriage and motherhood. These men will be arriving shortly to make their selections. Every unmarried woman between 16 and 30 is required to present herself on this platform for consideration. No exceptions. No exemptions. My stomach churned so violently I thought I might be sick right there in the square, in front of everyone, adding one more humiliation to the collection I'd already accumulated. "When I call your name," Sheriff Brennan said, "you'll come forward and stand in the line forming here." He gestured to the platform behind him. "You'll remain there until all the women are assembled, and then the men will make their choices in order of their arrival. First come, first served." The sheriff began calling names alphabetically, and one by one, women climbed the platform steps and took their places in a line that looked exactly like what Sarah had said, like cattle at auction presented for evaluation and purchase. I watched Rebecca Lapp ascend the steps with her head held high, her posture perfect. I watched Emma Stoltzfus follow, already promised to Samuel but required to appear regardless of her engaged status. I watched women I knew and women I barely recognized take their places in a line that represented everything wrong with the community I'd been born into, a place where human worth could be measured and assigned, where women existed primarily as solutions to men's practical needs, where someone like me could be forced to stand before everyone I'd ever known and be publicly evaluated as wanting. Mara Ellison. My name cracked across the square like a whip, and somewhere in the crowd I heard laughter. Not loud, but unmistakable. The kind of laughter that says, "We all know how this will end, so we might as well enjoy the show." I forced my feet to move, climbing the steps on shaking legs, acutely aware of every eye following my progress. The red dress suddenly felt too tight, too bright, too much like a spotlight highlighting every flaw I'd spent my life being reminded of. I took my place at the end of the line, next to Mary Byler, who was 16 and crying silently, tears tracking down her terrified face. On instinct, I reached over and squeezed her hand, and she gripped back with desperate strength. "It'll be all right," I whispered, though I had no idea if that was true for either of us. The last few names were called, and finally, all 23 of us stood on the platform, arranged like goods in a shop window. The crowd had grown quieter now, anticipation replacing the earlier buzz of conversation. Somewhere in the mass of faces, I spotted Mother standing stiff and straight beside Father, her expression carefully neutral, giving away nothing. Sheriff Brennan consulted his pocket watch, then nodded with satisfaction. "The men should be arriving any moment. Ladies, stand up straight and try to look presentable. This is your opportunity to secure your futures, so I suggest you make the best of it." The minutes that followed felt like hours. My legs ached from standing still. The sun beat down on my prayer cap, making my scalp itch beneath the tightly pulled hair. Beside me, Mary Byler's silent crying had progressed to visible shaking, and I kept hold of her hand, offering the only comfort I could, the knowledge that she wasn't alone in her terror. Then, from the north road leading into town, came the sound of hoofbeats. The crowd turned as one, and I watched 5 men ride into the square on horses that looked as road-weary as their riders. These were not the men of Redford, with their plain clothes and careful beards and hands that smelled of honest earth. These were cowboys, men in worn leather, with hats that had seen too much sun, with guns holstered at their hips and eyes that had witnessed things our sheltered community couldn't imagine. They dismounted and approached the platform, and I saw Sheriff Brennan's expression tighten slightly. Whatever he'd been expecting, these particular men weren't quite it. The first man was older, perhaps 50, with gray in his beard and a limp that suggested old injuries. The second and third were younger but rough-looking, with faces that seemed permanently set in expressions of suspicion. The fourth was handsome in a conventional way, his smile easy and practiced as he surveyed the line of women like a merchant evaluating inventory. But it was the fifth man who made my breath catch. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span half the platform's width. His face was heavily scarred, one long mark running from his left eyebrow down across his cheek, another cutting through his right jaw. His eyes were dark and hard, his expression completely closed off, and everything about his posture suggested a man who wanted to be anywhere else in the world but here. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward to greet them, his tone friendly but slightly uncertain. "Gentlemen, welcome to Redford. I trust your journey was—" "Where are they?" The massive scarred man's voice was like gravel scraping stone, rough and deep, and completely devoid of social pleasantries. The sheriff blinked. "I'm sorry?" The women you said needed husbands. Where are they? Right here, Mr. Carter. Boone Carter. He didn't offer his hand, and after a moment the sheriff's outstretched palm dropped awkwardly to his side. Well, Mr. Carter, as you can see, we have 23 fine women for you and your companions to— I didn't bring companions. Boone Carter's tone was flat. I came alone. These men happened to be on the same road. An uncomfortable silence settled over the square. This clearly wasn't the script Sheriff Brennan had prepared, and I watched him struggle to adapt. I see. Well, regardless, you're welcome to make your selection from our available women. They've all been raised in good Christian homes, taught proper domestic skills, and— I'm not here by choice. Boone Carter interrupted again, his eyes scanning the line of women without any particular interest. Judge Matthews, back in Silver Creek, said if I didn't find a wife within the month, he'd hang me for that business with the Anderson gang. So here I am. Let's get this over with. The crowd murmured at this revelation. A criminal, or at least someone adjacent to criminal activity, standing in their square and discussing wives like discussing the weather. Several mothers pulled their daughters closer, and I saw more than one father's hand move to where a weapon might be hidden. Sheriff Brennan's face had gone slightly pale. Mr. Carter, I wasn't informed that you were under any sort of legal obligation. You wanted men who needed wives. I need a wife. What difference does it make why? Boone Carter's scarred face remained completely expressionless, but something in his tone suggested he was one wrong word away from mounting his horse and leaving all of us behind. The sheriff clearly had the same thought. None at all, he said quickly. Please, take your time and select whichever woman suits your needs. Boone Carter didn't move. He stood there, his dark eyes moving along the line with all the enthusiasm of a man being asked to select his own coffin. When his gaze reached me at the end of the line, it paused for the briefest moment before moving on, and I felt something inside my chest crack just a little bit more. Even a criminal being forced into marriage by a judge's ultimatum couldn't muster interest in me. The handsome cowboy, who'd introduced himself as Jack Morrison, had already approached Rebecca Lapp, his practiced smile widening as he looked her up and down with obvious approval. You'll do nicely, he said, his tone suggesting she should be flattered by his attention. What's your name, sweetheart? Rebecca's mother beamed from the crowd, already calculating the social benefits of having a daughter chosen first. But before Rebecca could answer, Sheriff Brennan stepped forward again, his expression showing strain. Mr. Carter, as the first to arrive in Redford, you have the right of first selection. Would you please make your choice so we can proceed in proper order? Boone Carter turned those hard, dark eyes on the sheriff, and for a long moment I thought he might simply refuse. Then he sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to carry years of weariness, and looked back at the line of women. You, he said, pointing. Everyone's eyes followed his gesture, and I felt the crowd's attention shift like a physical weight. I expected to see him pointing at Rebecca, or maybe Emma, or any of the dozen women who were objectively more attractive, more acceptable, more everything than— he was pointing at me. The square fell completely silent. I stared at Boone Carter, certain I'd misunderstood. Certain this was some sort of mistake. Certain that at any moment he'd correct himself and point to literally anyone else in the line, but he didn't move. His finger remained extended, aimed directly at me, and his scarred face showed no hint of humor or cruelty, just a tired determination to get through an unpleasant task as quickly as possible. Her, he said again, more firmly this time, as if repetition could somehow make this impossible situation real. I choose her. And the laughter began. The laughter started as scattered chuckles, but quickly built into something uglier, louder, more devastating than anything I'd experienced before. And I'd experienced plenty. Thomas Yoder's voice rose above the rest. The criminal and the cow, perfect match. His friends doubled over, slapping their knees, their faces red with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing someone else's humiliation. Mrs. Fisher, who ran the general store, actually had to wipe tears from her eyes, she was laughing so hard. Oh, Lord, that poor man doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. Even some of the women on the platform were smiling behind their hands, relief flooding their features now that the joke had found its target, and it wasn't them. Mary Byler dropped my hand like it had suddenly become contaminated. stepping slightly away from me as if my newly confirmed undesirability might be contagious. I felt my face burning, felt every inch of my skin prickling with shame so intense it was almost physical pain. The red dress that had seemed almost beautiful in my bedroom mirror now felt like a cruel costume, highlighting everything wrong with me for the entire town to witness and mock. Boone Carter stood unmoved by the laughter, his scarred face as impassive as carved stone. He didn't join in the mockery, but he didn't defend his choice either. He simply waited, patient as a mountain, for the noise to die down. It was Sheriff Brennan who finally restored some semblance of order, though his own mouth was twitching with barely suppressed amusement. "Well, Mr. Carter, that's certainly an unexpected selection. Are you quite sure you wouldn't prefer to—" "I said her." Boone's voice cut through the lingering laughter like an axe through wood. "Are we doing this or not?" The sheriff cleared his throat, clearly struggling between his duty to facilitate the choosing and his desire to save this stranger from what everyone in Redford understood to be a terrible mistake. "Miss Ellison, please step forward." My legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen at the end of the line, my mind screaming at my body to cooperate, to not add the humiliation of physical collapse to everything else. Around me, the other women were staring, some with pity, most with that same relief I'd seen in Mary Baylor's face, grateful that fate had chosen me as its victim instead of them. "Mara," my mother's voice carried across the square, sharp with mortification. She'd stepped out from the crowd, her narrow face tight with an expression I'd seen countless times, the look of a woman confronting yet another disappointment from her unfortunate daughter. "Don't make this more difficult than it already is. Go with the man." The casual cruelty of her words, the ease with which she dismissed any concern for what I might be feeling in this moment, finally broke through my paralysis. I forced my feet to move, descending the platform steps with as much dignity as I could manufacture while the entire town watched and whispered. As I approached Boone Carter, I kept my eyes fixed on the dusty ground, unable to look at his face, terrified of what I might see there. Regret, disgust, the dawning realization that he'd made a terrible error in judgment. He was massive up close, even more imposing than he'd seemed from the platform. I barely reached his shoulder, and standing next to him made me feel even more ridiculous, even more obviously wrong for this or any situation involving human partnership. "Look at me." His voice was quiet, meant only for my ears, but it carried a tone of command that made my eyes snap up before I could think better of it. His scarred face was even more intimidating at close range, the marks across his features telling stories of violence I couldn't begin to imagine. But his eyes, those dark eyes that had seemed so hard and cold from a distance, held something I hadn't expected. Not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either. More like a weary recognition, as if he saw something in my humiliation that he understood on a level deeper than words. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara." My voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mara Ellison." He nodded once, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "I'm Boone Carter. I have a ranch about 30 miles west of here, in the foothills. It's isolated, hard work, no neighbors for miles. I need someone who can cook, clean, tend animals, and not ask too many questions about my past." He paused, and something that might have been dark humor flickered across his expression. "Think you can handle that?" The question was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality of what was happening, that I almost laughed. Handle it? As if I had any choice, as if I'd be allowed to say no and return to my life in Redford, where I'd be forever marked as the woman too undesirable even for a criminal forced into marriage by legal threat. "I can work hard," I said instead, the only truth I had to offer. "I'm used to it." "Good enough." Boone turned to Sheriff Brennan, who'd been hovering nearby with increasing anxiety. "What do we need to do to make this legal?" The sheriff pulled out a document from his coat pocket, his hands fumbling slightly with the papers. "Just need both your signatures here and you'll be legally married under territorial law. Miss Ellison, you understand this is a binding contract? Once signed, you'll be Mr. Carter's wife with all the duties and obligations that entails?" Before I could answer, my mother pushed through the remaining crowd, father trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. Her face had gone from tight with embarrassment to calculating, and I recognized the shift immediately. She'd moved past her daughter's humiliation and into practical matters of reputation management. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice taking on the sweet tone she used with important church members and merchants who controlled her access to desirable goods. "Perhaps you'd like a moment to reconsider. I'm sure there are other women here who might be more suitable to your needs. My Mara, she's a good worker, as she said, but she has her challenges, and I'd hate for you to feel obligated. I've made my choice." Boone's voice was flat, final, allowing no room for argument. "Unless your daughter wants to refuse?" All eyes turned to me, and I understood the test inherent in his question. This was my chance to say no, to reject this stranger and his scarred face and his criminal past and his isolated ranch 30 miles from everything I'd ever known. This was my opportunity to choose the familiar humiliation of Redford over the unknown dangers of a life with Boone Carter. I looked at my mother's face, saw the hope there that I would refuse, that I would save her from the shame of having a daughter married off to a man the whole town now saw as either desperate or dangerously strange. I looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who'd spent 24 years making sure I understood exactly what they thought of my worth. I looked at the other women on the platform, at Rebecca Lapp, who was now being courted by Jack Morrison, at Emma Stoltzfus, who'd be going home to my brother Samuel, at all the girls who had futures in Redford, while I had only an endless present of the same diminishment, day after day after day. "I'll sign," I said. Mother's face went pale. "Mara, think about what you're—" "I said I'll sign." I turned to Sheriff Brennan, holding out my hand for the pen with more confidence than I felt. "Where?" The sheriff showed me the line, and I signed my name in the careful script I'd learned in the schoolhouse where children had thrown stones at me during recess. Mara Ellison. The last time I'd write that name as an unmarried woman, the last moment I'd exist as my parents' disappointing daughter, rather than Boone Carter's unlikely wife. Boone signed below my name, his handwriting surprisingly neat for a man with such rough hands. The sheriff witnessed both signatures, and just like that, with a few scratches of ink on paper, my entire life changed direction. "Congratulations," Sheriff Brennan said, though his tone suggested condolences would be more appropriate. "You're now legally married. Mr. Carter, you're expected to provide for your wife and treat her according to Christian principles. Miss Ellison, Mrs. Carter, you're expected to honor and obey your husband in all reasonable matters. May God bless your union." The words felt hollow, rote, like lines from a play everyone was performing without believing. But they were binding nonetheless, and I was now Mrs. Boone Carter, wife of a scarred stranger who'd chosen me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. "We're leaving." Boone's announcement cut through the awkward silence that had fallen over the square. "Now." "Now?" Mother's voice rose in pitch. "But surely Mara needs time to gather her things, to say proper goodbyes." "What things?" I asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd forgotten that I owned almost nothing of value, nothing beyond the 3 work dresses and the red one I was wearing, nothing that would be missed or mourned if left behind. Father stepped forward, and for the first time that day, he looked directly at me. "Mara, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. You could stay, help your mother around the house, maybe in time—" "In time what, Father?" The question came out harder than I'd intended, all the years of swallowed hurt suddenly pressing against my throat. "In time the town might forget what they think of me? In time I might become acceptable enough to marry one of the men who've been mocking me since childhood? What exactly changes if I stay?" He had no answer, and his silence was more honest than any words could have been. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, pressing something into my hands. "Take this," she whispered urgently. "It's not much, but it's yours. I've been saving it for you, hoping—" She didn't finish, just pulled me into a fierce embrace that smelled of bread and kindness and all the comfort I was leaving behind. "You write to me, you hear? You write and let me know you're all right. Promise me." "I promise," I said, against her shoulder, holding on to her for one moment longer before forcing myself to let go. Jacob stood behind his wife, that same uncomfortable expression from the morning still on his face. But he stepped forward and shook Boone's hand with surprising firmness. "You take care of my sister, Mr. Carter. She's worth more than this town ever gave her credit for. Boone's eyes narrowed slightly, studying my brother with new interest. I'll keep that in mind. Mara. Samuel had appeared at the edge of the crowd, his fiancée Emma clutched to his side. He looked like he wanted to say something, struggled with it for a long moment, then simply nodded. It wasn't much, but from Samuel, it was probably the kindest gesture he could manage. Mrs. Yoder approached with a basket covered in cloth. Some bread and cheese for your journey, she said briskly, her tone all business as if she hadn't been party to decades of communal judgment. It's a long ride to the foothills, and you'll need your strength. Thank you, I said, taking the basket with hands that had started shaking again. Boone moved to his horse, a massive black gelding that looked as road-weary and patient as its owner. He swung into the saddle with practiced ease, then extended his hand down to me. You'll ride with me until we can get you your own horse. I stared at his outstretched hand, scarred and calloused and impossibly large. The idea of mounting that enormous horse, of sitting pressed against this stranger for 30 miles, of leaving everything I'd ever known despite how much pain it had caused me, it all seemed suddenly, overwhelmingly impossible. Mara. His voice was quiet again, meant only for me. It's not going to get easier by waiting, and I'd like to make it back to the ranch before nightfall. The practical concern in his tone steadied me somehow, made this feel less like a dramatic life change and more like a simple problem to solve. I reached up, placed my hand in his, and felt his fingers close around mine with surprising gentleness. He pulled, I pushed off the ground, and somehow I found myself seated sideways in front of him, my red dress bunched awkwardly around my legs, my body pressed against his in a way that would have been scandalous if we weren't now legally married. Hold on to the saddle horn, he instructed, adjusting his arms so he could manage the reins while keeping me stable. And try not to fall off. I'm not stopping to pick you up until we're clear of town. There might have been humor in his voice, or it might have been my imagination desperately searching for something warm in this cold transaction. Either way, I gripped the saddle horn with both hands, feeling the horse shift beneath us, powerful muscles bunching in preparation for movement. Boone turned the horse toward the north road, the same road he'd ridden in on less than an hour ago. The crowd parted to let us pass, and I felt their eyes following us, judgment and speculation, and relief that this strange drama was ending and they could return to their normal lives, their normal concerns, their normal certainties about who belonged and who didn't. As we reached the edge of the square, I made the mistake of looking back. Mother stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable at this distance. Father had his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort or restraint. I couldn't tell. Sarah was still crying, waving with one hand while Jacob held her steady with the other. The rest of the town had already started to disperse, the show over, the entertainment concluded, tomorrow's gossip already taking shape in whispered conversations I'd never have to hear. Don't look back, Boone said quietly above my head. It doesn't help. You sound like you know from experience. I do. He clicked his tongue and the horse began to move, walking first, then moving into a smooth trot that carried us past the last buildings of Redford and onto the open road. I've left a lot of places behind. Looking back only makes it hurt more. We rode in silence for a while, the afternoon sun beating down on my prayer cap, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait gradually relaxing muscles I hadn't realized were tensed. The road stretched ahead of us, rutted dirt flanked by fields turning golden in the early September light. Behind us, Redford grew smaller and smaller until it was just a cluster of buildings in the distance, insignificant against the rolling Pennsylvania hills. Why did you choose me? The question escaped before I could stop it, breaking the silence that had felt almost comfortable. I need to understand. Was it because you thought I'd be desperate enough not to ask questions? Because I'd be grateful enough to accept anything? Or was it just that you wanted to get the choosing over with as quickly as possible, and You were standing at the end of the line, Boone interrupted, his voice rumbling through his chest and into my back where I was pressed against him. Holding hands with that crying girl, trying to comfort her when you were clearly terrified yourself. I twisted slightly, trying to see his face, but the angle was wrong. That's why you chose me? Because I held Mary Byler's hand? Partly. He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought he might not continue. Then, My mother used to say you could tell a person's character by how they acted when they were suffering. Most people, when they're hurt or scared, they either lash out or they curl inward. Protect themselves first. But some people, even in their own pain, reach out to help others. Those are the ones worth knowing. The words settled over me like a blanket, warm and unexpected. Your mother sounds wise. She was, past tense. Died when I was 15, cholera epidemic that swept through our town in Kansas. Took half the population in 3 weeks. I'm sorry. Long time ago. But the roughness in his voice suggested time hadn't healed those wounds as completely as he wanted to believe. Anyway, that's why I chose you. Seemed like maybe you had the kind of character that could survive on a ranch in the middle of nowhere with a husband who's got more past than future. The sheriff said something about an ultimatum from a judge, about the Anderson gang. Boone's arms tightened slightly around me, not threatening, just tense. You sure you want to hear this? Might change your mind about climbing on this horse. We're already married and several miles from town. Little late to change my mind. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it held no humor. Fair point. All right, 3 years ago, I was working as a ranch hand in Colorado. Good job, decent pay, kept my head down and minded my business. Then the Anderson gang rode through, 10 men, armed and mean, looking for supplies and whatever else they could take. They hit the ranch where I was working, killed the owner, burned the buildings, took the horses. I felt myself tensing, already anticipating where the story was going. I was in the north pasture when it happened, too far away to help. By the time I got back, it was over. Smoke everywhere, bodies everywhere. And I knew if I didn't do something, those men would just move on to the next ranch, the next town, leaving the same destruction behind them. So you went after them, I said quietly. I tracked them for 2 weeks, caught up with them in a town called Silver Creek. There was a confrontation. 3 of them died. The rest scattered. I was arrested, thrown in jail, would have been hanged for murder if Judge Matthews hadn't been there when the gang hit the town. He'd seen what they were capable of, understood why I'd done what I'd done. But the law's the law, and I'd still killed 3 men, regardless of the reasons. The horse's hooves clipped against stone where the road crossed a shallow stream, the sound echoing in the late afternoon stillness. So the judge made me a deal, Boone continued. Said I could hang for murder, or I could agree to settle down, get married, become the kind of citizen the territory needs instead of another drifter with violent tendencies. Gave me 1 month to find a wife and prove I was serious about changing my ways. Otherwise, back to jail to await execution. That's why you came to Redford. That's why I came to Redford. Heard about some town doing a choosing, figured it was my best chance to fulfill the judge's requirement before the month was up. I've got 2 weeks left before I have to report back to Silver Creek with proof of marriage. I absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the violent story with the man who'd chosen me, at least partly because I'd held a frightened girl's hand. Are you a violent man, Boone Carter? The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Finally, I can be, when I need to be. But I don't seek it out, don't enjoy it. I have a line. And when people cross it, when they hurt folks who can't defend themselves, something in me won't let it stand, got me in trouble more times than I can count. The scars on your face? Different fights, different places. The one across my eye was from a man who tried to rob a widow in Kansas City. The one on my jaw was from a brawl in Santa Fe when 3 cowboys decided it would be fun to rough up the Chinese man who ran the laundry. I'm not a good man, Mara. Want you to understand that from the start. But I try to be decent when I can, and I don't hurt people who don't deserve it. The honesty in his words was almost shocking in its directness. I'd spent my life navigating around truth, learning to read between lines and interpret silences, because people in Redford rarely said what they actually meant. But Boone spoke like someone who'd moved beyond the luxury of social niceties into some harder, clearer version of communication. I appreciate you telling me, I said finally. You needed to know what you're getting into. The ranch is isolated for a reason. I'm not well liked in most towns, have a reputation that follows me, and there's always a chance someone might show up looking for trouble. You need to be prepared for that. Need to know how to shoot, how to defend yourself if I'm not there. You're going to teach me to shoot? Among other things. Can you ride? A little. Farm horses, mostly. Nothing like this. I patted the gelding's neck, feeling powerful muscles shift beneath smooth hide. We'll work on it. Can you cook? I thought of the countless meals I'd prepared for my family, the bread that had sometimes turned out too hard because Mother insisted I was wasting ingredients if I added enough liquid, the stews that had been criticized for being too thin or too thick or too seasoned or not seasoned enough. I can cook. Whether you'll like what I make is another question. Long as it's edible, I'll be grateful. Been living on hardtack and beans for the better part of 3 years. Anything else is an improvement. He shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting our position as the road began to climb into hillier terrain. What about you? Any expectations I should know about? Things you'll need from me beyond basic provision? The question caught me off guard. No one had ever asked what I needed before. I'm not sure what to expect from a marriage. I wasn't exactly raised with the assumption that I'd have one. Because of how you look. He said it bluntly, without judgment, the way someone might comment on the weather. I felt heat rising in my face despite the directness I'd just been appreciating. Yes. For what it's worth, I don't much care what you look like. Never have cared about that with people. What matters to me is whether someone's honest, whether they work hard, whether they can be counted on when things get difficult. Everything else is just decoration. That's very practical, I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice and not entirely succeeding. Boone must have heard it anyway because he sighed, a heavy sound that ruffled the hair escaping from my cap. I'm not good with words, Mara. Not good with making people feel better about themselves. My mother used to despair of me ever learning proper social graces. What I'm trying to say badly is that you don't need to worry about meeting some standard of appearance with me. I chose you. Not because I was desperate, not because you were convenient, but because I saw something in you that suggested we might actually manage to survive being married to each other. That's more than most people get in these arrangements. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't even particularly kind, but it was honest, and there was something almost comforting in that honesty after a lifetime of navigating cruel lies disguised as concern. All right, I said. Then I'll try to be honest with you too. I'm scared, terrified actually. I've never been more than 5 miles from Redford, never done anything without my mother telling me exactly how I'm failing at it, never imagined I'd leave everything I knew to ride off with a stranger to a place I can't even picture. But I'm also... I had to stop, had to swallow against the sudden tightness in my throat. I'm also relieved, because even though I'm scared, even though I have no idea what comes next, at least I'm not standing in that square anymore. Being laughed at by everyone I've ever known. Boone's arms tightened around me again, and this time it felt protective rather than tense. No one's going to laugh at you at the ranch. It's just us, the animals, and about 1,000 acres of land that needs constant attention. You'll be too busy to worry about what anyone thinks, and too far away to hear them even if they're thinking it. That sounds almost peaceful. It can be. It can also be lonely, isolating, harder than anything you've experienced. Winter in the foothills is brutal. Summer brings droughts and fires. Spring floods the low pastures. It's constant work just to survive, let alone prosper. You're not making a very appealing case for your ranch, Mr. Carter. I'm being honest, Mrs. Carter. You'll find I'm better at that than at making things sound pretty. But there was something in his tone that might have been amusement, a slight warming that made him seem almost human instead of just intimidating. The sun had moved lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. We'd left the cultivated fields behind, entering wilder country where trees crowded close to the road and the hills rose steep on either side. The basket Mrs. Yoder had provided bounced against my leg with the horse's rhythm, and I suddenly realized I hadn't eaten since before dawn. As if reading my mind, Boone said, "We'll stop at the creek ahead. Let the horse drink and rest. You can eat something if you're hungry." "Are you hungry?" "I'm always hungry. Comes from too many years not knowing when the next meal might come." True to his word, he guided the horse off the road when we reached a wider stretch of creek, the water running clear over smooth stones. He dismounted first, then reached up to help me down, his hand spanning my waist easily as he lifted me from the saddle as if I weighed nothing at all. My feet touched ground and my legs immediately buckled, muscles screaming from the unfamiliar strain of riding. Boone caught me before I fell, steadying me with a hand under my elbow. Takes some getting used to. Walk around a bit, get the blood flowing again. I stumbled in small circles while he tended to his horse, loosening the saddle and letting the animal drink from the creek. My red dress was dusty and wrinkled. My prayer cap sat crooked on my head, and I probably looked as exhausted and disheveled as I felt. But there was no one here to judge me for it. No one to whisper about my appearance or find me lacking. Just Boone Carter and his horse, and the endless Pennsylvania wilderness stretching in all directions. I sat on a fallen log and opened Mrs. Yoder's basket, finding fresh bread, sharp cheese, apples, and a jar of what looked like preserved peaches. My stomach growled audibly at the sight, and I quickly broke off pieces of bread and cheese, offering half to Boone when he came to sit beside me. We ate in silence, broken only by the creek's gurgling and the occasional bird call from the surrounding trees. The food was simple but good, and I found myself actually enjoying it without the usual anxiety of wondering whether I was eating too much, taking more than my share, proving yet again that I was the problem Mother had always said I was. "Can I ask you something?" Boone said after finishing an apple in 4 efficient bites. "You're my husband now. I suppose you can ask me anything." "Why didn't you refuse? Back in the square when I gave you the chance to say no, why didn't you take it? You had to know it would be easier to stay with your family than run off with a stranger." I considered his question carefully, searching for words adequate to explain something I wasn't sure I fully understood myself. Easier isn't always better. Staying in Redford would have been familiar, but it wouldn't have been easy. It would have been the same diminishment, day after day, year after year, until I died having never been anything except the disappointing daughter, the woman too unacceptable to marry, the joke everyone told to feel better about their own lives. At least this way, I gestured vaguely at the wilderness around us. At least this way I'm something different, even if I don't know what that something is yet. Boone nodded slowly, his scarred face thoughtful. "I can understand that. Sometimes the unknown is better than a known that's killing you slowly. Is that why you tracked down the Anderson gang? Because the unknown of facing them was better than the known of letting them destroy more lives?" "Something like that." He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. "We should get moving. Still have about 15 miles to cover before dark, and I'd rather not navigate the last stretch in full darkness." I let him pull me to my feet, noticing that his grip, while firm, never hurt, never squeezed harder than necessary. For someone who'd admitted to violence when provoked, he was remarkably gentle in ordinary interactions. We mounted again, settling into the same configuration as before, and continued down the road that grew narrower and rougher as we climbed higher into the hills. The landscape transformed around us, becoming wilder, more rugged, with fewer signs of human habitation and more evidence of nature reclaiming space. I saw deer watching us from between the trees, heard the distant cry of a hawk, smelled pine and earth and water in combinations that Redford's tamed farmland never produced. "Tell me about the ranch," I said as the shadows lengthened and the temperature began to drop, "so I know what to expect when we arrive." "It's not much," Boone warned. "One-room cabin that needs repairs, barn that's seen better days, chicken coop, smokehouse, root cellar, about 100 head of cattle ranging across the property, though I'll need to do a proper count soon. 6 horses besides this one, a milk cow, some pigs, the usual." "And you manage all of that by yourself?" "Been trying to. It's why I'm behind on the repairs. Never enough hours in the day to handle the animals, maintain the buildings, work the land, and everything else that needs doing." He paused. "Having a partner will help, if you're willing to learn." "I'm willing." The certainty in my voice surprised me. I've been doing farm work my whole life. I know animals, know crops, know what needs doing and when. I might not know your specific land, but I can learn. "Good." There was approval in his tone, perhaps the first time anyone had approved of anything about me without qualification or condition. "We'll start tomorrow. Tonight, once we get there, you can settle in, get some rest. Tomorrow morning, I'll show you the property, introduce you to the routine, see what skills you already have and what you need to learn." Darkness was falling fast now, the sun sinking behind the western hills and taking its warmth with it. I shivered slightly in my thin dress, and immediately felt Boone shift behind me, rearranging his coat to drape over my shoulders. It was heavy and warm and smelled of leather and horses and something distinctly masculine that I had no experience identifying. "Almost there," he murmured. "See that ridge ahead? Ranch is just beyond it, in a valley the creek runs through. Protected from the worst weather, good grazing, plenty of water year-round. It's why I bought it, even though the cabin was half collapsed and the previous owner had let everything go to hell." We crested the ridge as the last light faded from the sky, and I saw the ranch spread below us, dark shapes against darker shadows, with a single lamp burning yellow in a window of what must be the cabin. It looked impossibly small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness surrounding it, a tiny declaration of human presence in a landscape that cared nothing for such declarations. But it also looked like possibility, like a place where I might be able to become someone new, someone not defined by Redford's narrow judgments and my mother's disappointments, someone who existed simply as herself, without apology or explanation, or the constant weight of being found insufficient. Boone guided the horse down the slope and into the valley, and with each step closer to that small cabin with its welcoming light, I felt something inside my chest begin to loosen. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the space where hope might eventually take root if given enough time, enough distance, enough silence to grow in. The cabin was even smaller up close than it had appeared from the ridge. Made of rough-hewn logs chinked with clay, it sat maybe 20 feet square with a stone chimney on one side, already smoking from the fire Boone must have left burning before he'd departed that morning. A narrow porch ran along the front, sagging slightly on one corner where the support post had rotted through, and the single window beside the door was covered with oiled paper rather than glass. Boone dismounted and reached up for me again, and this time when my feet hit the ground, I managed to stay upright despite the screaming protest of muscles unused to hours of riding. He led his horse to the barn, a structure only marginally larger than the cabin itself, and I followed on unsteady legs, watching as he removed the saddle with practiced efficiency and began rubbing down the animal with handfuls of straw. "Water pump is behind the cabin," he said without looking up from his work. "Privy is about 50 yards east. Follow the path. Chicken coop is there beside the barn. Needs cleaning out, but that can wait until morning. Inside you'll find basics: bed, stove, table, not much else. I wasn't exactly expecting company when I built this place." I stood in the barn doorway, uncertain what to do with myself, where to put my hands, how to exist in this space that was now somehow mine but felt completely foreign. The lamp Boone had hung on a nail cast dancing shadows across the rough walls, illuminating farm tools I recognized and some I didn't, bags of feed stacked in one corner, leather tack hanging from pegs. The orderly chaos of a working ranch maintained by someone who understood efficiency even if he lacked resources for aesthetics. "You can go inside if you want," Boone said, glancing at me finally. "Get warm. I'll be another 10 minutes here, then I need to check the cattle one more time before full dark. Can I help?" He paused in his rubbing, studying me with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You just spent hours on a horse. You should rest." "I've spent hours on my feet doing farm work most days of my life. If you need help checking the cattle, I can walk." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something warmer than the careful neutrality he'd maintained most of the journey. "All right then. But grab something warmer than that dress. There's a coat hanging inside the door, should fit well enough." The cabin's interior was exactly as Spartan as he'd warned. A bed frame in one corner held a mattress that had seen better days, covered with quilts that looked homemade and worn thin from use. A cast-iron stove dominated the opposite corner, its fire burning low but steady, radiating blessed warmth into the single room. Between them sat a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, one of which wobbled slightly when I tested it. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins and jars and supplies I couldn't identify in the dim light from the single lamp burning on the table. And that was it. No decorations, no personal touches, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here rather than just survived here. The coat by the door was heavy wool, sized for Boone's frame and therefore enormous on me, but warm and practical. I pulled it on, rolling up sleeves that extended past my fingertips, and went back outside where Boone was waiting with a lantern in hand. "Stay close," he instructed as we walked away from the buildings and into the darkness beyond. "There's no fencing on most of the property, and it's easy to get turned around if you don't know the landmarks. Last thing I need is to lose my wife on her first night. The way he said wife was matter of fact, devoid of any particular emotion, but hearing the word applied to me still sent a strange jolt through my chest. Wife. Mrs. Boone Carter. A person with a defined role and purpose, however practical and unromantic that purpose might be. We walked in silence for perhaps 10 minutes, climbing a gentle slope toward where I could hear the low sounds of cattle settling for the night. The lantern cast a small circle of light around us, beyond which the darkness was absolute, unmarked by any of the reference points I'd relied on my whole life. No neighboring farms with their welcoming lights, no roads leading to familiar destinations, no church steeple rising against the stars to orient by. Just wilderness in all directions, vast and indifferent, and somehow less frightening than the civilized cruelty I'd left behind. The cattle were bedded down in a hollow, protected from the worst wind, dark shapes against darker ground, their eyes reflecting our lantern light as we approached. Boone moved among them with quiet confidence, checking for injuries or signs of illness, counting under his breath, his hands running over flanks and checking hooves with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. You know cattle, I observed, watching him work. Grew up on a ranch in Kansas before my parents died. Spent most of my childhood learning everything my father could teach me about managing livestock. He straightened from examining a young steer, brushing dirt off his knees. It's honest work. Animals don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not. You treat them right, they'll generally do what needs doing. Unlike people. Unlike people, he agreed, though in fairness, people have more complicated motivations than cattle. Can't really blame them for being difficult when life makes them that way. We finished the check and started back toward the cabin, and I found myself studying Boone's profile in the lantern light, trying to reconcile the violent past he'd described with the patient gentleness he showed his animals. He'd killed 3 men. He'd tracked the Anderson gang across Colorado and confronted them alone. He carried enough scars to tell stories of dozens of fights, and his reputation was apparently dark enough that he'd chosen isolation over community. But he'd also chosen me when he could have had any woman in that line. He'd explained his reasons honestly rather than leaving me to wonder and worry. He'd offered me his coat when I was cold, had given me the chance to refuse him, had asked what I needed rather than simply assuming. He was, in his own rough way, trying to be decent, and that was more than I'd gotten from most people who claimed to be good. "You're staring," he said without looking at me. "I'm trying to figure you out." "Not much to figure. What you see is what you get. Scarred, rough around the edges, better with animals than people, trying to stay alive and out of jail. That's the whole story." I don't think anyone's whole story is that simple. Maybe not. We'd reached the cabin, and he held the door open for me, gesturing me inside ahead of him. But simple or complicated doesn't change much in the end. We're married now, for better or worse, and we'll either figure out how to live together or make each other miserable trying. I'm hoping for the first option, but I've got enough experience with disappointment to be prepared for the second. I stepped into the cabin's warmth, grateful to escape the night chill, and turned to face him as he followed me inside and began banking the fire for the night. "I don't want to make you miserable." "Then we're starting from the same place, which is better than a lot of marriages manage." He straightened from the stove, his height making the cabin feel even smaller, more intimate than it had seemed when I'd been alone. "Now, we should talk about sleeping arrangements." My heart lurched into my throat, and suddenly all the vague anxiety I'd been successfully ignoring came crashing down. We were married, legally married, which meant certain expectations, certain duties, certain things that people whispered about, and that I'd overheard in scandalous fragments but never fully understood because no one had ever thought it necessary to explain them to the disappointing daughter who'd never need the knowledge. Boone must have seen something in my face because he held up both hands in a gesture of reassurance. "I'm not going to touch you, Mara. Not tonight. Not until you're ready. Maybe not ever if that's what you want. I chose you because I needed a wife on paper to satisfy the judge. What happens beyond that legal requirement is something we'll figure out together, at whatever pace makes sense." The relief was so intense I actually swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for. I'm not interested in forcing myself on an unwilling woman. Got no patience for men who think marriage gives them license to be cruel." He gestured toward the bed. "You'll sleep there. I'll take the floor by the stove. In a few weeks, once we know each other better and you're comfortable here, we can talk about other arrangements. But for now, that's how it'll be. The floor can't be comfortable. I've slept in worse places. At least here I'm warm and dry and no one's trying to kill me in my sleep. That's luxury by my standards. He pulled a bedroll from beneath the bed frame, unrolling it near the stove with the practice of someone who'd made many temporary beds in many temporary places. You should change out of that dress if you have something else to wear. Sleeping in your day clothes will ruin them faster than necessary. I looked down at the red dress that Mother had forced me into, now dusty and wrinkled and marked by the day's journey. I had nothing else. Every other piece of clothing I owned was still in Redford, folded in the trunk at the foot of my bed, abandoned along with everything else I'd left behind. I don't have anything else, I admitted quietly. I left without packing. Boone frowned, then moved to a trunk in the corner that I hadn't noticed earlier. He opened it and rummaged inside, eventually pulling out a shirt that looked like it had been white once before years of washing had turned it gray. This'll be too big, but it's clean and warm enough. You can wear it tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out what you need in terms of proper clothes. I took the shirt, soft flannel worn thin and smooth, and held it against my chest. It would hang to my knees, maybe lower, drowning me in fabric, but it was clean like he'd said, and it smelled of the same soap I'd noticed in the barn. Thank you. Stop thanking me for basic decency. It's depressing. But his tone was mild, almost teasing. I'll step outside while you change. Holler when you're done. He left, closing the door behind him, and I was alone in the cabin that was now somehow my home. I changed quickly, fumbling with the buttons of the red dress in the dim lamplight, my fingers clumsy with exhaustion and nervous energy. The dress fell to the floor in a pool of crimson, and I stepped out of it feeling like I was shedding a skin, leaving behind the Mara who'd stood in Redford Square being mocked by everyone she'd ever known. Boone's shirt did indeed hang to my knees, the sleeves extending a full 6 inches past my hands until I rolled them up. It was absurdly large and completely shapeless, and I'd never worn anything more comfortable in my life. The softness of the old fabric against skin rubbed raw by the day's tensions was almost enough to make me cry from sheer relief. "I'm dressed," I called, and Boone returned, carefully not looking directly at me as he moved to his bedroll and began removing his boots. I climbed into the bed, pulling the quilts up to my chin, feeling the mattress settle beneath my weight with creaks and groans that echoed my earlier shame at every sound my body made. But Boone didn't comment, didn't seem to notice or care, just lay down on his bedroll and pulled a blanket over himself with the efficiency of someone performing a routine task. "Lamp stays on low through the night," he said into the darkness. "I like to be able to see if something needs attention. That bother you?" No. In truth, I was grateful for it. The thought of complete darkness in this unfamiliar place had been hovering at the edges of my anxiety. "Good. Sleep well, Mara. Tomorrow comes early on a ranch." I lay there listening to his breathing slowly even out, watching shadows dance across the ceiling, feeling the unfamiliar weight of quilts that smelled of wood smoke and time. My body ached in new places. My mind raced with everything that had changed in a single day. And I should have been unable to sleep, should have spent the whole night staring at the ceiling and wondering what I'd done. Instead, I felt my eyes growing heavy, felt the day's exhaustion finally claiming its due. My last thought before sleep pulled me under was that for the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know what it would hold, but I wasn't afraid of it, and that small absence of fear felt like the most precious gift I'd ever received. I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of something sizzling on the stove. For one disoriented moment, I thought I was home in Redford, about to hear Mother's sharp voice calling me lazy for sleeping past dawn. Then I opened my eyes and saw rough log walls instead of familiar painted boards. Saw Boone's broad back as he worked at the stove, remembered everything that had happened yesterday with the force of a physical blow. "You're awake." Boone didn't turn around, somehow knowing I'd opened my eyes. "There's coffee when you're ready, and I'm making eggs. They're not fancy, but they'll keep you going." I sat up, acutely aware that I was wearing only his shirt and nothing else, but he kept his attention firmly on the stove, giving me space to feel less exposed. The morning light coming through the oiled paper window was gray and soft, suggesting early dawn, and when I checked the small clock on the shelf, I saw it was barely past 5. I should be making breakfast, I said, pushing back the quilts and standing on legs that screamed protest from yesterday's riding. That's my responsibility now. You can start taking on responsibilities once you know where everything is and how the routine works. For now, let me handle it. He did turn then, his scarred face neutral, but not unkind. There's a wash basin on the table. Water's fresh from this morning. Take your time getting ready. The water was cold enough to make me gasp when I splashed it on my face, but it shocked away the last cobwebs of sleep and helped me focus on the day ahead rather than the surreal strangeness of my new circumstances. I finger-combed my hair as best I could without a proper brush, rebraided it, and secured it under the prayer cap I'd worn yesterday, now slightly crushed but still serviceable. Boone handed me a tin cup of coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint, and a plate with scrambled eggs and a thick slice of bread. We ate standing at the table. There weren't enough chairs for both of us to sit comfortably, in a silence that wasn't quite companionable but wasn't hostile either. Just two people navigating the awkwardness of sudden intimacy without a map to guide them. So, Boone said after finishing his eggs in about 6 bites, today I'll show you the property, introduce you to the animals, explain the daily routine. You'll need to learn where everything is and what needs doing when. Questions? How much land do you have? About 1,000 acres, give or take. Most of it's rough pasture, not suitable for crops, but fine for grazing. There's a vegetable garden behind the cabin that I've been neglecting. Maybe you can take that over, see if you can rescue it before the frost comes. We get our meat from the animals we raise, trade eggs and milk for supplies in town when we need things we can't make or grow ourselves. How often do you go to town? Once a month, usually. Less in winter when the roads are bad. It's a full day's ride to Millerville, closest trading post with a decent general store. Not back to Redford. It wasn't a question. Not back to Redford, he confirmed. I've got no reason to go there, and I'm guessing you don't either. No. The relief in my voice was unmistakable. No reason at all. He nodded as if I'd confirmed something he'd suspected. Good. Then we'll avoid it. No point in revisiting places that don't want us. We spent the next several hours walking the property, with Boone pointing out landmarks and explaining boundaries with the patience of a man who understood that good teaching required repetition and time. He showed me the creek that ran through the valley, marking where it was safe to cross and where the current ran too swift, even in late summer. He showed me the cattle scattered across the hillsides, explained which ones were breeding stock and which were being fattened for sale, pointed out a young bull he was particularly proud of that he'd traded for last spring. The horses were kept in a fenced pasture near the barn, and he introduced me to each one by name and temperament. There was Shadow, the black gelding we'd ridden yesterday, steady and patient but prone to stubbornness if pushed too hard. There was Dancer, a bay mare with a white blaze who Boone said was the fastest horse he'd ever owned, but required an experienced rider. There was Copper and Steel and Dust and Bell, each with their own personalities, their own quirks, their own particular needs. You'll start with Bell, Boone decided, running his hand along the neck of a dappled gray mare who looked at me with liquid brown eyes that seemed almost kind. She's gentle, forgiving of mistakes, and won't throw you even if you do something stupid. Once you're comfortable riding her, we can move you to something with more spirit. When do we start? This afternoon, if you're up for it. But first, let me show you the rest. The chickens were kept in a coop that desperately needed cleaning, just as he'd mentioned last night. About 20 hens and 2 roosters scratched in the dusty yard, their coop smelling of old straw and neglect. Boone's expression turned slightly embarrassed as we approached it. I know it's bad. I've been meaning to clean it out for weeks, but there's always something more urgent, demanding attention. If you want to take this on, I'd be grateful. I studied the coop with the critical eye of someone who'd spent years managing similar structures. It was bad, but not unfixable. A few hours of hard work, fresh straw, some repairs to the roosting bars, and it would be functional again. I can handle this. You sure? It's not pleasant work. I've done worse. And I had. Years of the worst, dirtiest jobs on my family's farm because Mother didn't trust me with anything that required skill or judgment. At least here the difficulty would be physical rather than emotional. The vegetable garden was in even worse shape than the chicken coop. What had probably started as neat rows had been overtaken by weeds, the few remaining vegetables struggling beneath invasive growth. Tomatoes hung unpicked and rotting on vines, beans had gone to seed, squash lay split and fermenting on the ground. I don't have much talent for growing things, Boone admitted, surveying the disaster with his arms crossed. I can keep animals alive, but plants seem to die just from me looking at them wrong. This is salvageable. I knelt beside a row of carrots that were still viable beneath the weed cover, already mentally cataloging what could be saved and what needed to be cleared. Most of this can be cleaned up, and if we're quick about it, we might get a late crop of greens before the hard frost. Do you have seeds? In the barn, I think. The previous owner left some supplies. Then I'll start here this afternoon while you work with the horses. We can tackle the chicken coop tomorrow. Boone looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You're not afraid of work. Never have been. It's about the only thing I've ever been good at. I doubt that's true, but I'll take the help regardless. He glanced at the sun, now approaching its zenith. We should head back, get some lunch, let you rest a bit before this afternoon. Lunch was more bread and cheese, along with apples from a tree near the cabin that Boone said produced fruit so sour most people couldn't eat them raw, but which made excellent preserves if you had the sugar and patience. I ate 2 apples without complaint. I'd grown up eating whatever was available without the luxury of preferences, and watched Boone's expression shift to something like approval. You really will eat anything. Food is food. Complaining about it seems ungrateful when there are people who don't have enough. Practical philosophy. He stood, brushing crumbs from his shirt. All right, Mrs. Carter, let's see if we can teach you to ride properly. Fair warning, you're probably going to be sore tomorrow in places you didn't know you had places. He was absolutely right. The afternoon riding lesson left me aching in muscles I'd never specifically noticed before, my inner thighs screaming protest, my back tight from maintaining unfamiliar posture. But Belle was as patient as Boone had promised, tolerating my clumsy mounting attempts and uncertain seat without complaint, and by the time the sun started its descent toward the western hills, I'd managed to walk, trot, and even briefly canter without falling off or embarrassing myself too badly. You're a natural, Boone said, and I could tell he meant it rather than just offering empty encouragement. Most people take weeks to get comfortable in the saddle. You'll be riding Dancer by the end of the month at this rate. The praise warmed something inside my chest that had been cold for so long I'd forgotten it could feel otherwise. I dismounted carefully, my legs wobbling but holding, and helped Boone remove Belle's saddle and rub her down the way he'd shown me. Tomorrow we'll work on your shooting, he said as we walked back toward the cabin in the gathering dusk. Can't have you out here unable to defend yourself if trouble comes calling. Have you had trouble before? Not yet, but it only takes once, and if I'm not here when it happens, I need to know you can handle yourself. He held the cabin door open for me. For now, though, you should rest. I'll handle the evening chores, get dinner started. You've earned it after today. But I didn't rest. While Boone was outside checking on the animals one more time, I surveyed the cabin's supplies and found enough ingredients to make a simple stew. Dried beans that needed soaking, some root vegetables from the sadly depleted garden, a piece of salted pork that would add flavor if not much meat. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest food, the kind that filled bellies and sustained work, and I could make it well enough. When Boone returned to find the stew bubbling on the stove and fresh bread, made from supplies I'd found in the pantry, rising near the fire, he stopped in the doorway and just stared. I told you to rest. I rested on the ride back from the pasture. This is easy work compared to most days on my parents' farm. He shook his head slowly, but I saw something like respect in his expression. You're going to put me to shame if you keep this up. Good. Then maybe you'll appreciate what I bring to this arrangement beyond just satisfying a judge's requirement. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying more of my accumulated hurt than I'd meant to reveal. Boone's expression shifted, became more serious, more focused on me in a way that made me want to look away, but also felt important not to. Mara, I already appreciate what you bring to this arrangement. You're hardworking, you don't complain, you're willing to learn, and you haven't once looked at me with the disgust or fear that most people can't hide when they see these scars. That's more than I hoped for when I rode into Redford yesterday. He moved closer, not crowding but present. I know how that town treated you. I saw it in the square, heard it in the laughter, but whatever they made you believe about your worth, it's not the truth. You understand that? I wanted to believe him, wanted it so desperately it frightened me with its intensity. But 24 years of carefully constructed understanding about my place in the world didn't crumble from a few kind words, no matter how much I wished they could. I'm trying to understand it, I said finally, but it's hard to unlearn something you've been taught your whole life. I know. His voice was gentle in a way I was beginning to recognize as distinctly his, rough around the edges but sincere beneath. Just keep trying. That's all anyone can do. We ate the stew in more comfortable silence than breakfast had offered, the food simple but satisfying, and I felt a small spark of pride when Boone had a second helping without being prompted. Afterward, he insisted on cleaning up while I sat in one of the chairs, the one that didn't wobble, and simply existed without purpose or task for perhaps the first time in my adult life. You should write to your sister-in-law, Boone said as he scrubbed the pot clean. Sarah, right? You promised her you'd let her know you were all right. I did promise that. I'd forgotten in the rush of everything else, but he was right. Sarah had been kind when kindness was rare, and she deserved to know I'd survived my first day in this new life. Do you have paper and ink? Somewhere. I'll find it for you tomorrow, and next time I go to town, I'll post the letter. Probably be 3 weeks or so before that happens, but at least she'll get word eventually. The casual assumption that I'd still be here in 3 weeks, that this arrangement would last beyond the immediate necessity that had created it, settled something anxious in my chest. He wasn't treating this as temporary, wasn't looking for excuses to end it. Whatever else our marriage was or wasn't, it seemed to be real in the ways that mattered for daily survival. That night followed the same pattern as the one before. Me in the bed, Boone on his bedroll by the stove, the lamp burning low. The darkness beyond the cabin walls absolute and somehow comforting rather than frightening. But this time, as I lay there waiting for sleep, I felt less like I was suspended in uncertainty and more like I was settling into something that might, with time and effort, become a life rather than just an escape. Boone? I said into the darkness, not sure if he was already asleep. Yeah? Thank you for choosing me, for bringing me here, for being decent when you didn't have to be. There was a long pause, and I thought maybe he wouldn't respond. Then, you're welcome. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow we're teaching you to shoot, and I need you alert for that. I smiled into the darkness, feeling something warm and fragile and hopeful taking root where only resignation had grown before. The days that followed developed their own rhythm, shaped by the relentless demands of ranch work and the gradual, careful process of two strangers learning to exist together without causing each other harm. Boone taught me to shoot with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, starting with basic safety and working up to targets, correcting my stance and grip with hands that were large but surprisingly gentle. I proved to have a decent eye, hitting the target more often than not after the first few sessions, and I caught him looking almost proud when I managed to nail a tin can from 30 yards. I reclaimed the vegetable garden from the weeds that had tried to claim it, salvaging what I could and planning for next spring's planting. The chicken coop got its desperately needed cleaning, and the hens seemed to appreciate the fresh environment, producing eggs more reliably once their living conditions improved. I learned the rhythms of the ranch, when to milk the cow and when to feed the pigs, how to collect eggs without spooking the hens, where the best kindling could be found near the creek. Boone proved to be a man of few words but consistent actions. He never raised his voice, never showed impatience when I made mistakes, never treated me as anything less than a partner in the endless work of survival. He fixed the sagging porch step without being asked, found me a proper coat that fit better than his enormous one, showed me how to repair leather tack when it cracked, taught me the names of the stars that wheeled overhead in the impossibly clear night sky. We established small routines that began to feel comfortable. Coffee at dawn before the day's work began. Quick meals eaten standing at the table or sitting on the porch steps when the weather allowed. Evening checks of the animals together, walking the property in companionable silence. And at night, me in the bed, him on his bedroll, the space between us feeling less like a gulf and more like a respectful distance that neither of us was quite ready to close. 3 weeks into our marriage, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the western hills, Boone said, "I need to ride to Silver Creek next week. Report to Judge Matthews, show him the marriage certificate, prove I've fulfilled his requirements." How long will you be gone? 3 days, maybe 4. It's a hard ride and I need to settle some other business while I'm there. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'm wondering if you'd prefer to come with me or stay here and manage things while I'm gone. The question was carefully neutral, offering me a choice rather than making an assumption. I considered both options, weighing my lingering anxiety about being truly alone against my growing confidence in my ability to handle the ranch's daily needs. I'll stay, I decided. Someone needs to tend the animals, and I think I can manage for a few days, unless you'd prefer I come. I'd prefer you do whatever makes you comfortable, but I trust you to handle things here if that's what you choose. Trust. Such a simple word, such profound implications. He trusted me to manage his ranch, his animals, his property in his absence. Trusted me not to run, not to fail, not to prove all of Redford's harsh judgments correct after all. Then I'll stay, I said more firmly, and I'll make sure everything's in order when you return. He nodded, and in the dying light, I saw something in his expression that might have been relief, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been something else entirely that I didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. The morning Boone left for Silver Creek came with unseasonable cold, frost coating the grass in crystalline white that crunched beneath our boots as we walked to the barn together. He'd been up before dawn, packing supplies for the journey, checking and rechecking his gear, with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that overlooked details could mean the difference between arriving safely and not arriving at all. "The rifle stays with you," he said, positioning it prominently near the cabin door where I could reach it quickly. "I showed you how to load it, how to aim, how to fire. If anyone comes around while I'm gone, anyone you don't recognize or who makes you uncomfortable, you don't engage. You get inside, bar the door, and you shoot through the window if they try to force entry. Understand?" I understand. My mouth was dry despite the cold, the reality of being completely alone for the first time settling over me like a weight. "But Boone, nothing's going to happen. We're miles from anywhere. Who would even come out here? Probably no one, but I need to know you're prepared just in case." He finished tightening Shadow's saddle, then turned to face me fully, his scarred features serious in the gray pre-dawn light. "Mara, I'm trusting you with everything I have. This ranch, these animals, they're all I've built since leaving Kansas. If something happened to them because I left you unprepared, I'd never forgive myself." "Nothing will happen," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I'll take care of everything. You just focus on convincing Judge Matthews you're a reformed citizen so he doesn't hang you." A brief smile crossed his face, there and gone like sunlight through clouds. "I'll do my best. There's money in the tin on the shelf if you need it for emergencies, though I can't imagine what emergency might arise in 3 days that would require cash. The well rope is fraying. I noticed it yesterday but didn't have time to replace it. Be careful when you're drawing water. And the gate on the south pasture has been sticking. I oiled it, but watch it doesn't catch and injure one of the horses." "Boone." I reached out without thinking, touching his arm to stop the flow of worried instructions. "I can do this. You've taught me well. Trust that." He looked down at my hand on his sleeve, and for a moment something passed across his expression that I couldn't read. Then he nodded once, decisive. "You're right. I'm fussing like a worried mother hen. You'll be fine." He swung up into the saddle, Shadow shifting beneath his weight. "I'll be back by Thursday evening at the latest. If I'm delayed, don't panic. Sometimes the road to Silver Creek gets tricky this time of year." "Thursday evening," I repeated, committing it to memory. "I'll have supper waiting." He looked at me from his elevated position, and in the growing light I saw something in his eyes that might have been affection, or might have been simple appreciation, or might have been the beginning of something neither of us was ready to name. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Carter." "You too, Mr. Carter." He clicked his tongue and Shadow moved forward, breaking into a smooth trot that carried them down the valley and toward the ridge that marked the boundary of the ranch. I stood watching until they disappeared over the rise, Boone's figure growing smaller and smaller until it was just a dark speck against the dawn sky, and then nothing at all. The silence that settled over the ranch after his departure was different from the quiet I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 weeks. That had been companionable silence, the comfortable lack of unnecessary words between two people focused on their work. This was absolute silence, broken only by natural sounds, Wind through the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the creek's persistent gurgle. No other human voice, no reassuring presence of someone who'd proven themselves steady and reliable. Just me and 1,000 acres of wilderness and the animals that depended on me for their survival. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and got to work. The first day passed in a blur of familiar tasks made strange by their solitary nature. I milked the cow, collected eggs from the hens, fed the pigs their morning slop, checked on the horses in their pasture. Every job took longer without Boone's efficient presence, without his ability to handle two things simultaneously while I managed a third. I found myself talking to the animals more than usual, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the emptiness. But the chickens didn't judge my rambling monologues, and Belle seemed to appreciate the conversation during her afternoon brushing. Lunch was bread and cheese eaten standing at the table, the cabin feeling cavernous without Boone's bulk filling half the space. I'd grown so accustomed to his presence, the sound of his breathing, the creak of floorboards under his weight, the rustle of his clothing as he moved, that his absence felt physical, like something had been removed from the air itself. The afternoon brought unexpected challenges. The well rope that Boone had warned me about frayed completely on my third attempt to draw water, sending the bucket plummeting into the depths with a splash that echoed up mockingly. I spent an hour rigging a new rope from supplies in the barn, my hands shaking with frustration and the lingering fear that if I couldn't solve this problem, everything else would cascade into disasters I couldn't handle. But I did solve it. The new rope held, the bucket came up full of clean water, and I felt a surge of accomplishment so intense it nearly brought tears to my eyes. I'd fixed something, without help, without instruction, without anyone telling me I was doing it wrong or could have done it better. Just me and a problem and a solution I'd figured out through trial and error. Evening chores went smoothly enough. The cattle were all accounted for in their usual grazing areas. The horses settled without complaint. The chickens roosted peacefully in their cleaned coop. I made myself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, ate it while watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple, and tried not to think about how many more sunsets I'd watch alone before Thursday evening. That first night was the hardest. The cabin felt too empty, too quiet, too vulnerable to every sound that drifted in from the darkness beyond the walls. I left the lamp burning brighter than necessary, kept the rifle within arm's reach of the bed, and lay awake for hours listening to the wind and wondering if every creak and rustle signaled danger, or just the normal sounds of a ranch at night that I'd never noticed when Boone's steady breathing had provided a reference point of safety. But nothing happened. No bandits appeared, no wild animals attacked, no disasters unfolded. Just a long, quiet night that eventually gave way to dawn, and with dawn came the reassurance that I'd survived one day and could therefore survive another. The second day found me settling into a routine, moving through the tasks with more confidence now that I'd proven I could handle them alone. I took Belle out for a ride around the property, checking the fence lines the way Boone had taught me, looking for damage or weak points that might let cattle stray. I found one post that had come loose, managed to reset it using techniques I'd watched Boone demonstrate, felt that same surge of accomplishment when it held firm under my testing. I tackled the vegetable garden with renewed energy, clearing more of the remaining weeds, harvesting the last of the late squash before frost could claim them, turning the soil to prepare for winter dormancy. The physical work was meditative, allowing my mind to wander over the past month, examining how much had changed since that afternoon in Redford Square. I was different now. Not just in location or marital status, but in some fundamental way I was still discovering. The Mara, who'd stood in that red dress being laughed at by her entire community, had been someone who'd accepted limitation as destiny, who'd believed the harsh assessments of her worth because they'd been repeated so often they'd become indistinguishable from truth. But that Mara was being slowly replaced by someone who could fix well ropes and reset fence posts and manage a ranch alone for 3 days. Someone who ate without guilt, worked without apology, existed without constantly measuring herself against impossible standards, and finding herself wanting. I still carried all the old wounds. 3 weeks couldn't heal 24 years of damage. But they'd stopped bleeding. They'd scabbed over, begun the slow work of becoming scars instead of open injuries. And if Boone Carter, with his face full of scars, could still be decent and capable and worthy of respect, maybe there was hope that I could carry mine without letting them define everything I was or could become. The second night was easier than the first. I still kept the rifle close and the lamp burning, but I slept in stretches instead of lying awake for hours. I dreamed of Redford, of standing in the square again, but in the dream when the laughter started, I simply walked away, mounted Belle, and rode back to the ranch where Boone was waiting with coffee and a list of chores and the kind of acceptance that didn't require me to be anything other than what I was. I woke on the third morning to find the first real frost had arrived overnight, coating everything in white and signaling the end of whatever growing season remained. I spent the morning winterizing the garden, covering the few remaining cold hardy plants with straw, making notes about what to plant next spring in the small journal I'd found in Boone's trunk and claimed for my own use. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. I was in the barn, organizing tack that had gotten jumbled during the past weeks of intensive use, when I heard hoofbeats approaching from the east. My heart immediately kicked into overdrive, remembering Boone's warnings about strangers, about danger, about the kind of trouble that could find isolated ranches. I grabbed the rifle from where I'd propped it near the barn door and moved to the entrance, positioning myself where I could see the approaching rider without being immediately visible myself. The man who came into view was older, perhaps 60, riding a tired-looking mare and leading a packhorse loaded with supplies. He wore the rough clothes of a traveling peddler, and when he spotted the cabin he raised one hand in greeting, calling out in a voice weathered by years of outdoor living. "Hello, the house! I'm a trader, name's William Mackenzie, meaning no harm. Just wondering if you folks need any supplies." I stayed in the barn's shadow, rifle ready but not raised, watching as he approached slowly, making no sudden movements. He looked harmless enough, but Boone had taught me that appearances could deceive, that the most dangerous threats often came disguised as friendly faces. "My husband isn't home," I called back, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "You can leave your business with me if you'd like, but you'll need to stay mounted and keep your distance." Mackenzie nodded, apparently unsurprised by the caution. "Sensible woman. Your husband's lucky to have someone who doesn't take foolish chances." He stayed on his horse, maintaining a respectful distance from the barn. "I'm just passing through on my way to Millerville. Figured I'd offer my wares to anyone living out this way. Got fabric, tools, some spices, dried goods, household items. Nothing fancy, but useful for folks living remote." "We don't need anything right now." I was proud of how calm I sounded, how I channeled Boone's no-nonsense directness, instead of the nervous apologizing I'd been raised to offer to anyone who might take offense. "Fair enough. Mind if I water my horses at your trough before I move on? It's a long ride still to Millerville, and they're running dry." I considered the request, weighing Boone's warnings about strangers against basic human decency toward a tired old man and his exhausted animals. "You can water your horses, but you stay mounted while they drink, and you move on immediately after. Agreed?" "Agreed, ma'am." "I appreciate the kindness." I watched from the barn as Mackenzie walked his horses to the trough near the well, staying in his saddle as promised, letting the animals drink their fill while he made no moves toward the cabin or barn or any of the outbuildings. He was true to his word, and after a few minutes he tipped his hat in my direction and called out, "Thank you kindly, ma'am. You tell your husband William Mackenzie appreciates the hospitality. I'll be coming back through in spring if you folks need a trader then." "Safe travels," I called back, and watched him ride away toward the west, disappearing eventually into the tree line that marked the far edge of the property. Only after he was completely out of sight did I allow myself to lower the rifle, my hands shaking with belated fear, my heart still racing. I'd handled it. A stranger had appeared, potentially dangerous, and I'd managed the situation without panic, without violence, without anything going wrong. Boone would be proud when I told him, I thought, and immediately felt foolish for how much that imagined approval mattered to me. But it did matter. His opinion had come to mean something over these past weeks, his quiet respect and trust more valuable than any flowery compliments could have been. He saw me as capable, and in seeing me that way, he'd helped me start to see myself that way too. The rest of the third day passed without incident. I made bread that actually turned out well, not rock hard like my early attempts back in Redford, but soft enough to tear easily, with a crust that crisped just right. I mended one of Boone's shirts that had torn at the shoulder, my stitches not beautiful but functional, holding the seam together in a way that would survive hard wear. I wrote a long letter to Sarah, telling her about the ranch and the animals and the work, carefully editing out both the hardest struggles and the deepest fears, presenting a version of my new life that was truthful without being worrying. That night, I slept deeply, exhausted by 3 days of managing everything alone, confident now that I could survive until Boone's return. Thursday couldn't come fast enough, but I knew I'd be all right until then. Thursday dawned clear and cold, promising the kind of bright autumn day that made physical work almost pleasant instead of simply necessary. I attacked the morning chores with energy renewed by the knowledge that Boone would be home by evening, that I'd successfully managed his ranch in his absence and could present him with a property running smoothly instead of having fallen into chaos. I cleaned the cabin thoroughly, swept the floor and dusted the shelves and even scrubbed the table until the old wood gleamed as much as years of use would allow. I made stew from the last of the vegetables I'd harvested and the salted pork I'd been saving, letting it simmer through the afternoon until the cabin filled with rich, savory smells. I milked the cow and collected the eggs and fed the pigs and did everything that needed doing with an efficiency born of 3 days of practice. Evening arrived, but Boone didn't. The sun set behind the western hills, painting the sky in familiar colors, and still the ridge remained empty of riders. I tried not to worry, remembering his words about delays being possible, about the road sometimes being difficult. Thursday evening, he'd said, but evening had a flexible definition. It wasn't truly concerning until full darkness fell and he still hadn't appeared. By the time the stars came out, brilliant and cold against the black sky, worry had transformed into active anxiety. I kept the lamp burning in the window, a beacon visible from the ridge for anyone approaching. I checked on the horses 3 times, as if Boone might have somehow appeared in the pasture without me noticing. I reheated the stew until it was on the verge of burning, then pulled it off the heat and waited, standing at the cabin door and staring out into darkness, broken only by starlight and my inadequate lamp. He'd said not to panic if he was delayed, but he'd also talked about trouble that could find people on isolated ranches, about enemies from his past who might come looking for revenge, about all the ways that violence could interrupt even the most peaceful lives. What if he'd run into the remnants of the Anderson gang? What if Judge Matthews had decided a month wasn't enough reformation and had arrested him anyway? What if he was lying hurt somewhere between here and Silver Creek, needing help I couldn't provide because I didn't even know where to look? I was standing at the door, rifle in hand, considering the absolute insanity of trying to ride out and search for him in the dark, when I finally heard hoofbeats approaching from the east. Relief flooded through me so intensely I had to grab the doorframe for support, my legs suddenly weak, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. Shadow came over the ridge, his dark coat barely visible against the night sky, but his movement unmistakable. And on his back, slumped slightly in the saddle in a way that immediately renewed my worry, was Boone. I ran to meet him, abandoning all pretense of calm competence, splashing through the frost-crisp grass in my worn boots. "Boone, are you hurt? What happened? You said Thursday evening, and I know what I said." His voice was rough, strained, as if speaking required more energy than he had to spare. "Had some trouble in Silver Creek. Nothing I couldn't handle, but it delayed me." He swung down from the saddle, moving stiffly, and in the lamplight spilling from the cabin I saw his left sleeve was dark with what could only be blood. "You're bleeding." The words came out surprisingly steady despite the panic clawing at my throat. "Come inside. Let me see it." "It's not as bad as it looks. Just a knife wound, didn't hit anything vital. I got it cleaned and wrapped in Silver Creek, but the bandage needs changing." He let me take Shadow's reins, let me lead both him and the horse toward the barn, not protesting when I took charge in a way that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. I got Shadow unsaddled and rubbed down with shaking hands, talking the whole time to keep my rising hysteria at bay. There was a trader who came through yesterday, asked to water his horses, and I let him, but I kept the rifle ready the whole time and he didn't cause any trouble. The well rope broke on Monday and I fixed it. The fence post in the south pasture was loose, so I reset it. Everything's been fine here. All the animals are healthy. I made stew and bread and kept everything running just like you taught me. But Boone, you have to tell me what happened in Silver Creek because you're bleeding and you look exhausted and I don't know how to help if you don't tell me what's wrong." "Mara." He caught my hand, stilling my frantic movements. Breathe. I'm all right. Tired and hurting, but all right. Let's get inside, get this arm properly tended, and then I'll tell you everything. But you need to calm down first before you work yourself into a panic. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and helped him into the cabin. In the better light, I could see the extent of the damage. His left sleeve soaked with blood from shoulder to elbow, his face pale beneath the tan, exhaustion etched into every line and scar. He sank into the chair that didn't wobble, and I immediately began cutting away the fabric of his shirt, revealing a crude bandage wrapped around his upper arm that had soaked through completely. I need clean cloth, hot water, and the salve from the shelf, I said, surprised by my own steadiness when inside I was screaming. And you need to tell me exactly what I'm looking at here. Someone in Silver Creek recognized me from Colorado. Had a brother in the Anderson gang. Wanted revenge for what I'd done 3 years ago. Came at me with a knife in an alley behind the saloon. We fought. I won. But not before he got this cut in. Boone's voice was matter of fact, as if discussing the weather instead of a murder attempt. Judge Matthews was there, saw the whole thing, confirmed it was self-defense. He signed off on our marriage, said I'd fulfilled his requirements, and was free to go. So that's done at least. I carefully unwrapped the bandage, revealing a long gash across his bicep that had been stitched shut, but was still seeping blood at one end where the stitches had pulled loose. It looked angry and inflamed, the kind of wound that could turn dangerous if infection set in. Did a doctor do these stitches? Town barber. Best Silver Creek has to offer. Well, they're coming out and I'm redoing them. These are too loose, they're never going to hold properly. I was already moving, gathering supplies, heating water, my hands working while my mind focused on the task at hand instead of the fear that wanted to overwhelm me. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. Do what you need to do. I removed the inadequate stitches with a knife I'd sterilized in boiling water, cleaned the wound with whiskey that made Boone hiss through his teeth, but didn't make him pull away, and then restitched the gash with the careful precision I'd learned from years of mending clothes and occasionally animals. My hands didn't shake. My focus didn't waver. I worked steadily until the wound was properly closed, then covered it with clean bandages and bound his arm tightly enough to hold everything in place without cutting off circulation. "Where did you learn to do that?" Boone asked when I finally stepped back, surveying my work with critical eyes. "Farm life. You learn to handle injuries when they happen because you can't always get to a doctor. I've stitched up horses, cows, pigs, my brothers more times than I can count. Never thought I'd be sewing up my husband." "Your husband." He repeated the word slowly as if testing their weight. I like that. The way you say it, like it's real instead of just a legal formality. It is real. I met his eyes, seeing past the exhaustion and pain to something deeper, something that had been building between us through weeks of shared work and careful trust. "You're my husband. I'm your wife. That's real, regardless of how it started." Boone reached out with his good arm and caught my hand, pulling me closer until I stood between his knees, looking down at his scarred face turned up toward mine. "I was worried about you, being here alone. Spent half the ride home imagining everything that could go wrong. And then I get back and find the ranch running perfectly, the animals cared for, the cabin clean, dinner waiting. You handled everything, including a stranger appearing while I was gone. You've become quite something, Mara Carter." The praise should have embarrassed me, should have made me deflect or minimize my accomplishments the way I'd been trained to do. Instead, I felt pride bloom warm in my chest, fierce and undeniable. I learned from a good teacher. "I don't think I taught you what you became. I think that was already in you, just waiting for a chance to come out." His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand, a gesture so casual and yet so intimate it made my breath catch. "I'm glad I chose you. Not just because you can handle ranch work or because you stitch up knife wounds without fainting. I'm glad because you're good company, good partnership, good in ways I wasn't expecting and don't quite have words for. I'm glad you chose me, too." The words came out whisper soft but completely honest. "Even when it's hard, even when I'm scared, even when I don't know what I'm doing, I'm still glad." We stayed like that for a long moment, his hand holding mine, my body close enough to feel his warmth, both of us balanced on the edge of something that neither was quite ready to name or claim. Then Boone's stomach growled audibly, breaking the tension and making both of us laugh. "You need to eat," I said, stepping back reluctantly. "And then you need to sleep. You look like you're about to fall over." "I feel like I'm about to fall over. But yeah, food sounds perfect. That stew I'm smelling. Made it special for your return, though it's been sitting waiting for hours, so I can't promise it hasn't gotten overcooked." It wasn't overcooked. It was in fact probably the best thing I'd ever made, the flavors having had time to meld and deepen during their long wait. Boone ate 2 full bowls, tearing into the bread I'd made with the hunger of someone who'd been living on trail rations for 3 days. I ate less, still too wound up from the evening's drama to have much appetite, but I sat across from him and felt something settle into place inside my chest. This was what marriage could be, I realized. Not the cruel mockery I'd witnessed in my parents' relationship, where every interaction was calculated for maximum impact and minimum warmth. Not the resigned partnerships I'd seen in Redford, where people stayed together out of obligation and familiarity rather than any genuine affection. But this, 2 people choosing each other repeatedly, day after day, in small ways and large ones, working together, trusting each other, caring about each other's well-being, not because duty demanded it, but because the alternative had become unthinkable. "You should take the bed tonight," I said when he'd finished eating. "You're injured and exhausted. I'll sleep by the stove." "Absolutely not. You've been working alone for 3 days. You deserve the bed. Boone, you can barely keep your eyes open. Don't be stubborn about this." I'm always stubborn about things that matter. But he was swaying slightly in his chair, exhaustion finally claiming its due. "How about we compromise?" "What kind of compromise?" "Bed's big enough for 2 people if we're careful about it. We've been married a month now, lived together, worked together, proven we can coexist without making each other miserable. Maybe it's time to stop pretending we need quite so much distance between us." My heart hammered against my ribs, fear and hope tangled together so tightly I couldn't separate them. "Are you sure? I mean, you said we'd wait until I was ready, and I don't want you to feel obligated because you're injured and need the bed, and I'm not sure I'm ready for everything that might imply. And, Mara," he stopped my rambling with just my name. "I'm not talking about obligations or implications. I'm talking about sleeping in the same bed because we're both tired, we're both adults, and there's no good reason why you should sleep on the floor, or I should when there's a perfectly adequate bed right there. We can figure out everything else as we go. But for tonight, can we just be 2 people who've learned to trust each other, sharing space because it makes practical sense?" Put that way, it did make practical sense. And maybe that was the key to navigating this. Not grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, but practical choices made one at a time, building something real from the foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. "All right," I said, "but you stay on your side and I'll stay on mine. And if this gets weird, we go back to the old arrangement." "Deal." He stood with visible effort, favoring his injured arm. "Help me get this shirt off? Can't manage it one-handed." I helped him remove what remained of his ruined shirt, trying not to stare at the expanse of scarred chest and muscled shoulders revealed in the lamplight. He was marked by violence, old scars crisscrossing his torso, newer ones on his ribs and back. The story of a hard life written on his skin in tissue that had healed wrong and marks that would never fade. But underneath the scars was just a man, tired and hurting and trusting me enough to show vulnerability in a way I suspected he rarely allowed. He washed quickly at the basin while I changed into his soft flannel shirt that had become my nighttime uniform, both of us moving around the small cabin in a dance that had become familiar over the past weeks. Then, with the lamp turned low and the fire banked for the night, we climbed into the bed from opposite sides, me against the wall and him on the outside, careful not to touch, hyper-aware of each other's presence in the darkness. "Thank you," Boone said quietly, "for taking care of everything while I was gone, for taking care of me when I got back, for being here. Thank you for coming back." I kept my eyes on the ceiling, not trusting myself to look at him without revealing more than I was ready to show. "I was worried when you didn't arrive on time. I'll try not to worry you again. That's not a promise you can keep. Not with the life you've lived, the enemies you've made. Things happen, Boone. I understand that now. All we can do is handle them as best we're able when they come." "When did you get so wise?" Probably somewhere between fixing that well rope and restitching your arm. Turns out when you stop expecting the world to end every time something goes wrong, you develop a little perspective. He laughed, a quiet sound in the darkness, and I felt the bed shake slightly with his amusement. I really am glad I chose you, Mara. Best decision I've made in years, even if it started as obligation. Second best decision, I corrected. Second? The best decision you made was not joining in when everyone laughed at me in that square. Everything else followed from that. The bed shifted as he turned toward me, his weight changing the mattress enough that I felt myself rolling slightly in his direction. I didn't join in because there was nothing funny about it, just a whole town being needlessly cruel to someone who'd never done anything to deserve it. Made me angry, actually. Made me want to choose you just to spite them all. So you chose me out of anger? I turned my head on the pillow, finally looking at him. In the low lamplight, his profile was all sharp angles and shadow, the scars standing out like dark rivers across his features. I chose you because you were kind to that girl when you had every reason to be bitter. Because you had grace under pressure, dignity and humiliation. Because I saw something in you that reminded me of my mother, that ability to maintain compassion even when the world's being harsh. The anger just made the choice easier. He was quiet for a moment. Does it bother you that it started that way? No. I was surprised to find it was true. How it started matters less than what it became. And this, I gestured vaguely at the space between us, the cabin, the life we'd built in 4 short weeks. This is better than anything I imagined possible a month ago. It's not perfect, he warned. It's going to get harder as winter comes. We're going to get on each other's nerves, have disagreements, struggle with the isolation and the work and everything else. This peaceful beginning won't last forever. I know, but Boone, even when it gets hard, even when we fight or struggle or want to quit, it'll still be better than what I left behind. Because here, I'm treated like a person. I'm seen as capable. I'm given chances to prove myself instead of being written off before I start. That's worth fighting for. His hand found mine in the darkness, our fingers intertwining with the natural ease of a gesture that had become familiar through work but now carried new weight in this new context. Then we'll fight for it together. Whatever comes, we handle it as a team. Agreed? Agreed. We lay there in comfortable silence, hands linked between us, exhaustion finally dragging us both towards sleep. Just before I drifted off, I felt Boone's thumb trace the same gentle circles on my hand that he'd done earlier, a gesture that was becoming his signature way of offering comfort without words. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more opportunities to build this unlikely partnership into something that might eventually resemble love. The weeks following Boone's return from Silver Creek settled into a rhythm that felt almost dangerously comfortable, as if the universe might notice how content I'd become and decide to correct the situation. But the correction never came. Instead, autumn deepened into early winter, the work intensified as we prepared for the harsh months ahead, and the careful distance we'd maintained began to erode in ways both subtle and significant. Sharing the bed had changed something fundamental between us. Not in the dramatic way stories suggested such things happened, but in quiet increments. Waking to find we'd migrated toward each other's warmth during the night, the casual touches that came from existing in close proximity, the conversations whispered in darkness that revealed things neither of us would have said in daylight. Boone told me about his mother's death, about the guilt he still carried for surviving when half his town hadn't. I told him about the years of cruelty disguised as concern, about the slowly accumulating weight of being treated as defective until you started to believe it yourself. His arm healed cleanly thanks to my careful tending, the stitches coming out after 2 weeks to reveal a scar that would join all his others, one more mark of survival in a body covered with them. He taught me to shoot with increasing accuracy until I could hit targets at 50 yards more often than not. I taught him to cook beyond basic trail food, showing him how proper seasoning and technique could transform simple ingredients into meals worth anticipating rather than just enduring. We worked side by side through the shortening days, winterizing the ranch against the cold that crept down from the mountains with increasing determination. We insulated the barn, reinforced the chicken coop against predators that grew bolder as food became scarce, stocked the root cellar with everything we'd need to survive until spring. The cattle were moved to lower pastures where they'd have better shelter. The horses given extra hay, the pigs fattened for slaughter that would provide meat through the frozen months. It was during one of these preparation sessions, 6 weeks after our wedding, that Boone brought up the subject I'd been carefully not thinking about. "We need to make a trip to Millerville before the first serious snow," he said as we worked together to repair a section of barn roof that had started leaking. "Stock up on supplies we can't make or grow ourselves. Coffee, sugar, flour, fabric for proper winter clothes, other necessities." I hammered a nail into the new shingle, focusing on the task to avoid looking at him. "All right, when do you want to go?" "Next week, probably. Weather's been holding clear, but that won't last much longer." He paused in his own hammering. "Mara, Millerville isn't Redford. It's bigger, more diverse, people mind their own business mostly, but you should know that going to town, being seen as my wife, it's going to attract attention, questions, possibly comments that aren't kind." "Because of how I look or because of your reputation?" "Both, probably. I want you prepared for that. Want you to know that if it gets too uncomfortable, we leave immediately. Your well-being matters more than supplies." The casual way he prioritized my comfort over practical necessity made something warm bloom in my chest. I can handle a few stares and whispers. I've had 24 years of practice. "You shouldn't have had to practice." His voice carried an edge of anger directed not at me, but at the world that had made such practice necessary. "But since you did, at least it means you're prepared." The trip to Millerville took most of a day, leaving at dawn and arriving as afternoon shadows stretched long across the town's main street. It was indeed larger than Redford, maybe 3 times the size, with actual storefronts instead of just the general store and church that dominated my hometown. People moved with purpose along wooden sidewalks. Wagons and horses filled the street, and the noise was almost overwhelming after weeks of nothing but natural sounds and Boone's quiet voice. We hit Shadow and Bell outside the general store, and I felt eyes tracking us as we walked toward the entrance. A woman with 2 children actually stopped and stared, whispering something to her companions that made them all turn to look. I felt the old familiar heat rising in my face, the shame trying to reassert itself, but then Boone's hand found mine, his scarred fingers interlacing with my work-roughened ones, in a gesture that was both protective and proud. "Let them look," he said quietly. "We've got nothing to hide or be ashamed of." The general store was crowded with other ranchers and farmers making their pre-winter supply runs, all of them bundled against the cold, all of them giving us varying degrees of attention as we entered. The proprietor, a round man with impressive mustaches, looked up from helping another customer and his eyes widened slightly at the sight of Boone. "Carter, heard you were still in these parts. Figured the judge would have run you out by now or strung you up." His tone wasn't particularly friendly, but it wasn't openly hostile either, just the carefully neutral voice of someone conducting business with a customer of questionable reputation. "Judge Matthews and I came to an understanding." Boone's voice was flat, offering no additional information. "I need winter supplies. Got a list here." He handed over the paper we'd compiled together, detailing everything from coffee and flour to fabric and lamp oil. The proprietor scanned the list, his eyebrows rising slightly. "This is quite a bit. You running a ranch or supplying an army?" "Ranch. Just being prepared for a hard winter." Smart thinking. The man's gaze shifted to me, taking in my plain dress and work-worn hands, and the way I stood close to Boone. "This your wife? Heard rumors you'd gotten married, but figured they were exaggerated like most things people say about you." "This is my wife, Mara." Boone's arm moved around my waist, a gesture that was somehow both casual and deliberate. "Mara, this is John Wheeler. He runs the only decent general store between here and Silver Creek." "Ma'am." Wheeler nodded to me with professional courtesy that held no particular warmth but no obvious disdain either. "I'll get this list filled for you. Going to take maybe an hour. Got a lot to gather. You folks can wait here or come back." "We'll wait," Boone decided. "Need to visit the bank anyway. Take care of some business." We left the store and walked down the main street toward the bank, and I felt the weight of observation following us. People stared, some openly curious, some clearly judgmental, trying to understand what they were seeing. A scarred man with a dangerous reputation and a woman who didn't fit their narrow standards of acceptability, walking together like they belonged to each other. "Does it bother you?" I asked quietly as we walked. "The staring, the whispers, knowing what they're thinking about us?" "Used to. Spent years angry about it, letting it fuel fights and bad decisions." Boone's hand tightened on mine. "But I'm tired of being angry, Mara. Tired of letting other people's narrow minds dictate how I feel about myself or my choices. They can think what they want. I know what we've built, and that's what matters." We just reached the bank when a voice called out from behind us, sharp and commanding. "Boone Carter, hold up there." We turned to find a man in his 50s approaching, wearing a sheriff's star and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He wasn't hostile exactly, but he wasn't friendly either, just professionally alert in the way lawmen got around people with complicated pasts. "Sheriff Morrison." Boone's tone was respectful but wary. "Something I can help you with?" "Just wanted to confirm what I heard from Judge Matthews. You really went and got yourself married, reformed your ways like he required." "I did." Boone gestured to me. "This is my wife, Mara. We were married legally in Redford about 6 weeks ago. Ranch is running well, no trouble, just honest work and peaceful living." Sheriff Morrison studied me with sharp eyes that saw more than I was comfortable with, taking in my defensive posture and the way I unconsciously moved closer to Boone. "Ma'am, your husband treating you well? You here of your own free will?" The question caught me off guard, but I understood his concern. He was making sure Boone hadn't coerced or trapped me into this marriage, that I wasn't being held against my will. "I'm here of my own free will, Sheriff. My husband treats me with respect and kindness. No complaints." "Good to hear." Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Carter, I'll be honest. When Judge Matthews told me his plan, I thought it was foolish. Figured you'd either skip town or get yourself killed within the month. But if you're really making it work, really settling down, then I'm glad to be proven wrong. This territory needs more decent ranchers and fewer troublemakers. I'm trying to be the first instead of the second." Boone's voice carried a sincerity I'd learned to recognize. "Not saying I won't defend myself or mine if trouble comes looking, but I'm done seeking it out." "Fair enough. You keep your nose clean, we'll have no problems." Morrison tipped his hat to me. "Ma'am, you ever need help, for any reason, you come find me. Don't matter what your husband's reputation is, I'll make sure you're treated fair." "Thank you, Sheriff." We watched him walk away, and I felt some of the tension leave Boone's shoulders. That went better than expected. Morrison's fair-minded for a lawman, but he's got reason to be suspicious of me. Had to shoot one of his deputies 3 years back in self-defense. He understood it was justified, but I don't think he ever forgave it. "You've left a complicated trail behind you," I observed. "I have, but I'm hoping the trail forward will be simpler, less violence, more peace, building something instead of breaking things." He looked down at me, his scarred face serious. "That's what I want with you, Mara. To build something that lasts, that matters, that's worth more than just survival." Before I could respond, a commotion erupted near the saloon across the street. Raised voices, the sound of breaking glass, and then 2 men stumbled out onto the wooden sidewalk, grappling with each other while a small crowd gathered to watch. It was the kind of fight that probably happened weekly in any frontier town, fueled by whiskey and old grudges and boredom. I felt Boone tense beside me, his body shifting into readiness, and I recognized the pattern. Someone was in trouble. His instinct was to intervene, to enforce some personal code of justice that had gotten him into so much difficulty over the years. But then he forced himself to stillness, his hand gripping mine tighter, anchoring himself to me instead of to the violence. "Not our fight," he said, as much to himself as to me. "Sheriff's here. He can handle it." We stood together and watched Sheriff Morrison break up the fight with practiced efficiency, hauling both men to their feet and marching them toward what was probably the town jail. The crowd dispersed, the entertainment over, returning to their daily business as if violence was just another mundane occurrence. "I'm proud of you," I said quietly. Boone looked startled. "For what?" "For not rushing into that fight, for choosing to stay here with me instead of following your old instincts. I know that was hard for you." It was. His admission was raw, honest. Everything in me wanted to make sure no one was being hurt unfairly, but you're more important than my need to fix every wrong I see. That's what I'm learning. How to prioritize, how to let some things go, how to build a life instead of just reacting to the world around me. We finished our banking business and collected our supplies from Wheeler's store, loading everything onto Belle's saddlebags and the pack frame we'd brought specifically for this purpose. The sun was already descending toward the western mountains, painting everything in amber and shadow, and we needed to leave soon if we wanted to make it home before full darkness. But as we were securing the last of the supplies, I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. Mara Ellison, is that you?" I turned slowly, already knowing who I'd see. Mrs. Yoder stood on the sidewalk, a basket over her arm, her expression caught between shock and something that might have been concern. Behind her, watching with undisguised interest, were two other women I recognized from Redford, neighbors who'd witnessed my humiliation in the square, who'd been part of the laughing crowd that day. "Mrs. Yoder," my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I didn't expect to see anyone from Redford here. We came for supplies, same as you. Your mother said you'd left with that cowboy, but we weren't sure if it was true or if—" She trailed off, clearly uncertain how to finish that sentence politely. "If I'd run away, if I'd been kidnapped, if I'd met some terrible fate." I supplied the endings she couldn't voice. "No, Mrs. Yoder, I married Mr. Carter legally and willingly. We run a ranch about 30 miles west of here. We're doing well." "You look different." Mrs. Yoder's eyes traveled over me, taking in my practical clothes, my confident posture, the way I stood next to Boone without shame. More substantial, somehow. It was probably meant as an insult, another reference to my weight, but I chose to interpret it differently. "I am more substantial. I've found I'm capable of more than anyone in Redford ever gave me credit for. It's amazing what you can accomplish when people stop telling you you're worthless." The barb hit its target. Mrs. Yoder flinched slightly, and the women behind her looked uncomfortable, probably recognizing their own complicity in years of casual cruelty. "Your mother misses you," Mrs. Yoder said finally. "She asks about you sometimes." "Does she?" I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. "Or does she just complain about the embarrassment of her daughter running off with a stranger?" "Mara, that's not fair, isn't it?" "Mrs. Yoder, be honest. Did anyone in Redford ever treat me fairly? Ever see me as anything other than a burden or a joke? Because from where I'm standing now, with distance and perspective, I can see clearly what I couldn't see then. That town was killing me slowly, day by day, with every laugh and whisper and disappointed look. So no, I don't particularly care if my mother misses me. I'm too busy living a life where I'm valued to worry about people who never valued me in the first place." The words hung in the cold air, more honest than I'd ever been with anyone from my old life. Boone's hand found my back, a silent offer of support, letting me handle this confrontation in my own way while making sure I knew he was there if I needed him. Mrs. Yoder's expression had shifted from shock to something that might have been shame. "You're right. We weren't kind to you. I wasn't kind to you, even when I saw what it was doing to you. I told myself I was just being realistic, just acknowledging the truth of the situation, but that was cowardice dressed up as honesty." She took a breath. "I'm sorry, Mara, for my part in making your life harder than it needed to be. You deserved better." The apology surprised me so much I almost didn't know how to respond. I'd imagined confronting people from Redford 1,000 times, had scripted angry speeches and devastating comebacks in my head during sleepless nights. But I'd never imagined anyone actually apologizing, actually acknowledging their wrongdoing. "Thank you," I said finally. "That means more than you probably know. If you'd be willing to write to your mother just to let her know you're well, I think it would ease her mind. Not because she deserves it, but because you're a better person than she was to you." "I'll think about it." It was the best I could offer, and Mrs. Yoder seemed to understand that, nodding and stepping back. "Take care of yourself, Mara. And Mr. Carter, you take care of her too. She's special, even if it took her leaving Redford for anyone to see it." We left Millerville as the last light faded from the sky, riding through darkness lit only by stars and the nearly full moon rising in the east. I was quiet, processing the unexpected encounter, sorting through complicated feelings about apologies and forgiveness, and whether either one changed anything fundamental about the past. "You handled that well," Boone said after we'd been riding for perhaps an hour. "Better than I would have in similar circumstances." I don't know if I handled it well or just differently than I would have a month ago. The old Mara would have apologized for making Mrs. Yoder uncomfortable, would have minimized her own hurt to make everyone else feel better. This Mara just told the truth. I'm not sure if that's growth or just exhaustion with pretending. It's growth. Exhaustion would have led to bitterness or anger. You were honest but not cruel, firm but not vindictive. That takes strength. We rode in silence for a while longer, the horses finding their way along the familiar trail with minimal guidance, the cold seeping through even our heavy coats as night deepened. Then, unexpectedly, I started laughing, not hysterical laughter, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of how much had changed. "What's funny?" Boone asked, sounding curious rather than concerned. "I was just thinking about that day in the square, about standing there in that red dress, being laughed at by everyone I'd ever known, certain my life was over. And now here I am, riding through the night with my husband, having just faced down my past and come out stronger, heading back to a ranch I helped manage and a life I actually want to be living. If you told me 2 months ago this is where I'd be, I would have thought you were insane. Life surprises us sometimes, usually in bad ways, but occasionally in good ones. This is a good one. Even with all the hard work and the isolation and the knowledge that winter's going to be brutal, even with all of that, this is still the best thing that's ever happened to me." I paused, gathering courage for what I wanted to say next. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Boone. Not just because you got me out of Redford, but because you see me, really see me, past all the surface stuff to who I actually am underneath. That's a gift I didn't even know I was missing until I had it." The horses walked on through darkness while my words hung between us. Then Boone pulled Shadow to a stop, and Belle stopped automatically beside him. He dismounted and came around to help me down, his hand spanning my waist, but instead of releasing me once my feet touched ground, he kept hold, pulling me close against him in the cold night. "Mara, I need you to understand something. When I chose you in that square, it was partly strategy and partly instinct, but it wasn't love. I didn't know you well enough for love. But now?" His scarred face was barely visible in the moonlight, but I could see his eyes, dark and serious and completely focused on me. "Now it's becoming love. Maybe it already is love, I'm not sure. I've never felt this before. This wanting to protect someone and challenge them at the same time. Wanting to give them space but also keep them close. Caring about their happiness as much as my own survival. If that's love, then I love you. And if it's not, then whatever it is, I want to keep feeling it." My breath caught in my chest, tears burning in my eyes from the cold and from emotion too large to contain. "I love you too. I think I started loving you when you didn't laugh, when you chose me anyway, when you treated me like I mattered. But I know I love you now, completely, probably foolishly, definitely, forever." He kissed me then, our first real kiss, and it was awkward and cold and perfect, lips chapped from weather and bodies bundled in coats and scarves. But underneath all that, just two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and decided to build something real from the wreckage of their separate pasts. When we finally pulled apart, both breathless and smiling, Boone said, "We should get home before we freeze to death out here. I'd hate to survive everything else only to die of cold on the trail because I couldn't wait to kiss my wife." "Your wife?" I tested the words, finding them comfortable in my mouth now, true in ways they hadn't been even a week ago. "I like being your wife." "I like you being my wife too. Now come on, Mrs. Carter, let's go home." The ranch appeared over the ridge like a promise kept, the cabin's windows dark but welcoming, familiar in the way that home becomes familiar, not through grandeur but through the accumulation of ordinary moments that transform a place into something irreplaceable. We tended the horses together, working in synchronized efficiency born of weeks of partnership, then stumbled into the cabin half-frozen and completely content. Winter came hard and fast after that, the first serious snow arriving within days of our Millerville trip and continuing intermittently for weeks. We were snowbound more often than not, the world contracting to just the ranch and each other. And instead of feeling trapped, I felt freed. Freed from the expectations of a community that had never wanted me. freed from the constant judgment and evaluation, freed to be simply myself with someone who loved that self without reservation or condition. We developed our own traditions during those long winter months. Morning coffee drunk while watching the sun rise over snow-covered hills. Evening stories told by lamplight, sharing pieces of our past that we'd kept hidden from everyone else. Cooking together, him learning patience with the process while I learned confidence in my instincts. Dancing clumsily in the small cabin to music only we could hear, laughing at our missteps and celebrating our small victories. The work was relentless. Animals still needed feeding regardless of weather. Water still needed hauling even when the pump froze. Firewood still needed chopping and hauling to keep us warm through sub-zero nights. But we did it together, and somehow that made even the hardest tasks feel less like burdens and more like shared adventure. Spring arrived slowly, teasing us with false thaws that gave way to more snow, until finally the grip of winter truly broke and the world transformed into mud and rushing water, and the first brave shoots of green pushing through dead grass. We planted the garden together, Boone following my instructions with the same attention he brought to everything, and watched with shared satisfaction as seeds we'd carefully saved began to sprout and grow. It was during one of these early spring days, as we worked side by side in the garden, that Boone brought up the subject I'd been expecting but dreading. Judge Matthews sent word. There's going to be a territorial gathering in Silver Creek next month. All the ranchers and farmers within 100 miles, celebrating the end of winter and conducting business, dancing, food, socializing. We're expected to attend. I sat back on my heels, wiping dirt from my hands, my stomach clenching with familiar anxiety. A gathering, like the choosing in Redford. Nothing like the choosing in Redford. His voice was firm. This is voluntary, social, meant to build community rather than display people like livestock. But I'll understand if you don't want to go, if the idea of being around that many people, being seen, being judged, is too much. I thought about the Mara who'd stood in Redford Square 6 months ago, terrified and humiliated, certain she'd never deserve anything better than mockery. Then I thought about the Mara who'd managed a ranch alone for 3 days, who'd stitched up her husband's knife wound without fainting, who'd confronted Mrs. Yoder with honesty instead of apologizing for existing. They were the same person, but also completely different, transformed by distance and love, and the steady accumulation of evidence that I was more than Redford had ever let me believe. I want to go, I said. Not because I'm not scared, because I am, but because I'm tired of letting fear dictate what I can and can't do, and because... I looked up at him, this scarred man who'd chosen me and loved me and built a life with me. Because I want to dance with my husband where other people can see, where they can know that we chose each other, that we're proud of each other, that we're not hiding or ashamed. Boone's expression softened into something that might have been pride or might have been love or might have been both. Then we'll go. And Mara? Anyone who dares to laugh or whisper or make you feel less than you are will answer to me. No. I stood, brushing dirt from my skirt, feeling strong and capable and ready to face whatever came next. They'll answer to me. I don't need you to fight my battles anymore. I can fight them myself. But having you beside me while I do it makes everything easier. The month passed in a blur of preparation, finishing spring planting, making sure the animals were settled, creating new clothes suitable for a social gathering. I made myself a dress from fabric we'd bought in Millerville, dark blue instead of red, practical but pretty, fitted properly to my body without apology or attempted concealment. Boone watched me work, occasionally offering opinions when asked, mostly just being present as I created something that represented who I was now rather than who Redford had tried to make me. The journey to Silver Creek took 2 days, camping one night along the trail, arriving in town as the sun set on the second evening. The gathering was being held in a large barn on the edge of town, and as we approached, we could hear music drifting out, fiddles and guitars, and the stomp of dancing feet, joyful sounds that made something in my chest ache with longing. We hitched our horses and walked toward the entrance, and I felt Boone's hand find mine, his familiar gesture of support and partnership. The barn was crowded with people, easily 100 or more, ranging from young children to elderly couples who'd probably attended these gatherings for decades. Long tables held food contributed by various families, and in the center a space had been cleared for dancing where couples moved through formations I didn't recognize but desperately wanted to learn. We entered and heads turned, conversations paused, the ripple of attention spreading through the crowd as people registered our presence. I saw the same sequence of reactions I'd witnessed in Millerville: recognition of Boone and his reputation, assessment of me and my obvious inadequacy, calculations about what our presence meant and whether we deserved acknowledgement or rejection. But this time, instead of shrinking under their examination, I stood straight and met their gazes steadily. Let them look. Let them judge. Their opinions didn't define my worth anymore. Only mine did, and Boone's, and the life we'd built together that functioned perfectly well without their approval. Sheriff Morrison approached first, his wife on his arm, both of them smiling with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Carter, Mrs. Carter, glad you could make it. My wife's been wanting to meet the woman who finally got this troublemaker to settle down." Mrs. Morrison was a comfortable-looking woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Sarah. "Don't listen to my husband. He's been hoping Boone would find someone decent for years. I'm Ann Morrison, and I'm delighted to meet you. Mara Carter." I shook her offered hand, grateful for the genuine welcome. "Thank you for having us." "Having you? Dear, this is a community gathering. Everyone's welcome, regardless of their past or their reputation or what anyone else thinks about them." Anne's pointed look at some of the less welcoming faces in the crowd made her meaning clear. "Now come on, let me introduce you to some of the other wives. You'll want to know who to trade with come summer, who makes the best preserves, who's got extra eggs when your hens aren't laying." She drew me into a cluster of women ranging from young to old, all of them engaged in the kind of practical conversation I'd been excluded from in Redford. These women talked about chickens and gardens and the challenges of winter isolation without any of the pretense or subtle cruelty I'd grown to expect. They asked about my ranch, about my skills, about what crops I was planting, treating me as a peer rather than an inferior. One woman, younger than me, with a baby on her hip, said casually, "That dress is beautiful. Did you make it yourself?" When I confirmed I had, she continued, "The stitching is excellent. I'm terrible at sewing. Everything I make looks like it was assembled by a drunk raccoon. Would you be willing to trade? I could give you eggs or cheese in exchange for help with sewing when we need it." "I'd be happy to." The words came easily, naturally, the beginning of the kind of community connection I'd always wanted but never been offered. I'm not an expert, but I can manage most basic projects. The evening progressed in a haze of conversation and connection, women sharing advice and stories, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from living hard lives in unforgiving conditions. I learned about preserving techniques I'd never tried, about medicinal plants that grew in the foothills, about how to predict weather patterns by watching animal behavior. And in return, I shared what I knew about garden management and chicken care and making bread in a cabin with a temperamental stove. But the best moment came later, as the music shifted into a slower tune and couples began pairing off for dancing. Boone appeared at my side, his hand extended, his scarred face serious, but his eyes warm. "Dance with me?" "I don't know how." The admission embarrassed me, but he just smiled. "Neither do I, not really. We'll figure it out together." He led me to the center of the barn, to the cleared space where other couples moved with varying degrees of skill and confidence. Around us, I felt the attention shift again, felt the whispers starting, but this time I didn't care. Boone's arms came around me, one hand at my waist and the other holding mine, and we began to move to the music with stumbling uncertainty that gradually found its own rhythm. "You're doing great," he murmured as we navigated around another couple. "Much better than you think. I'm stepping on your feet." "I can't feel it through these boots. Keep going." So I did. I let myself relax into the music and his guidance, let myself feel the joy of movement without worrying about judgment or evaluation. Around us, other couples danced and the fiddles played and the barn filled with laughter and conversation that had nothing to do with us, nothing to do with our worthiness or lack thereof, just people being people and letting us be ourselves among them. As the song ended and a new one began, faster and more energetic, I saw Mrs. Yoder enter the barn with a group from Redford. Among them was my mother, her narrow face scanning the crowd, freezing when she spotted me in Boone's arms on the dance floor. For one moment, fear tried to reassert itself. the old patterns of shame and inadequacy rising up to remind me of every harsh word and disappointed look. But then Boone's hand tightened on my waist, anchoring me to the present instead of the past, and I remembered who I'd become in the 6 months since leaving Redford. I met my mother's stare directly, steadily, without apology or explanation. Then I deliberately turned my attention back to Boone, standing on my toes to whisper in his ear, "I choose you again. Every time." His arms tightened around me, his scarred face transforming with a smile that was rare and precious because it was completely unguarded. "I choose you too. Always have, always will." We danced through the rest of the evening, sometimes with each other and sometimes with other partners as the community customs demanded. I danced with Sheriff Morrison, who proved surprisingly graceful for such a large man. I danced with an elderly rancher who told stories about the territory's early days while expertly guiding me through formations I'd never learned. I even danced with the young father whose wife had admired my dress, both of us laughing as we nearly collided with another couple during a particularly complicated sequence. My mother approached as I was taking a break, drinking water and catching my breath. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, the lines around her mouth deeper from years of holding disapproval like a constant expression. "Mara." Her voice was careful, controlled, the tone of someone navigating uncertain social terrain. "You look well." "I am well, Mother. Very well, actually. I heard about your marriage, about where you're living, what you're doing." She paused, clearly struggling for words. "I wanted to apologize for how things were in Redford, for how I treated you. You deserved better than I gave you." It was the second apology I'd received from someone connected to my old life. And like the first, it caught me completely off guard. I studied her face, looking for sincerity beneath the careful control, trying to decide whether this was genuine regret or just social obligation in the presence of witnesses. "Why now?" I asked. "Why apologize after all these years?" "Because Mrs. Yoder told me what you said in Millerville, about how the town was killing you slowly, and I realized she was right. We were killing you, I was killing you, with every disappointed look and harsh word and casual cruelty dressed up as honesty. I told myself I was preparing you for a hard world, but really I was just taking out my own disappointments on the easiest target." Her voice cracked slightly. "You were never the problem, Mara. You were always enough. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy trying to force you into a shape that didn't fit who you were." Tears burned in my eyes, and I blinked them back, determined not to cry in front of her, not to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much her words affected me. "I appreciate the apology, Mother. I do. But it doesn't change the past, and it doesn't mean I'm coming back to Redford. I've built a life here, with Boone, and it's a good life. Better than anything I had before." "I know. I can see that. You're different, stronger, more confident, more yourself than you ever were at home." She took a shaky breath. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm just asking if maybe, someday, you might be willing to write to me, to let me know how you're doing, to give me a chance to know the daughter I never took the time to understand when I had the opportunity." I looked past her to where Boone stood talking with Sheriff Morrison, both men's body language relaxed and friendly, evidence of a tentative peace being built between a reformed troublemaker and a fair-minded lawman. I looked at the women I'd been talking with earlier, now clustered around the food table, laughing at something one of them had said. I looked at the children running between the dancers, the elderly couples sitting on benches and watching the festivities, the whole complex tapestry of community that I was being woven into, thread by careful thread. "I'll write," I said finally. "Not often, and not with any promises about visiting or rebuilding what we never really had, but I'll write because holding on to anger takes energy I'd rather spend on building my future than mourning my past." Relief flooded my mother's face, tears spilling over despite her obvious attempt at control. "Thank you. That's more grace than I deserve." "Probably, but grace isn't about deserving it. It's about choosing to give it anyway, even when it's hard, even when the person asking doesn't have any right to expect it." I paused, then added more gently, "I hope you find peace, Mother. Real peace. Not just the appearance of it. And I hope someday you'll understand that the problem was never me being too much, but everyone else being too narrow to appreciate what I was." She nodded, unable to speak, and turned away, leaving me standing alone at the edge of the dance floor with my emotions churning and my heart both lighter and heavier than it had been before. Boone materialized at my side immediately, as if he'd been watching for signs I needed him. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I don't know yet. Ask me tomorrow, when I've had time to process." I leaned into him, grateful for his solid presence. "But Boone? I'm glad we came. Glad I got to face them. Got to show them who I became after leaving. Glad I got to dance with you where everyone could see that we chose each other and were proud of that choice." "I'm proud too." He pressed a kiss to my forehead, careless of who might be watching or judging. "Proud of you for facing down your past. Proud of us for building something real. Proud that out of all the women in that square in Redford, I had the sense to choose the one with the most strength and grace and capacity for love." The music shifted again into a tune that was joyful and fast, fiddles racing against each other while the guitar kept rhythm beneath. Couples flooded back onto the dance floor, and this time I was the one who grabbed Boone's hand and pulled him into the crowd. We danced until my feet ached and my face hurt from smiling, until the barn grew hot from so many bodies moving in close quarters, until the candles burned low and parents began gathering tired children to take them home. We danced past the point of grace into pure joy, stumbling and laughing and not caring who saw or what they thought, because we'd been chosen by each other, for each other, despite everything the world had tried to tell us about our worth. And that choosing, repeated daily through shared work and gentle touches and honest conversations, had transformed us both from broken pieces into something whole and strong and infinitely precious. As we finally left the barn, walking out into cool spring air that smelled of growing things and possibility, I looked up at the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns and felt something I'd never expected to feel: complete, utter, undeniable happiness. Not the fleeting kind that comes from temporary circumstances, but the deep, steady kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, with exactly who you're supposed to be with, building exactly the life you were meant to live. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Carter?" Boone asked, his arm around my waist, his voice warm with contentment. "Ready," I confirmed, leaning into him as we walked toward where our horses waited patiently. "Let's go home." And we did, riding through darkness toward the ranch that had become our sanctuary, carrying with us the knowledge that we'd faced down the past and claimed our future, that we'd been tested by isolation and hardship and doubt and emerged stronger for it, that we'd chosen each other not once but constantly, building a marriage that was real and true and entirely our own. The girl who'd been told she'd never be wanted had become a woman who knew her worth. The man who'd been marked by violence had found peace. And together, in a cabin in the Pennsylvania foothills, we built a life that proved love wasn't about perfection or meeting impossible standards, but about seeing someone completely, scars and strengths, fears and courage, everything they were and everything they could become. And choosing them anyway, every single day, until choosing them became as natural and necessary as breathing.